Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History for Deep Rest. Tonight we lower ourselves into the earth as winter tightens its grip and you find out how Native American communities built underground shelters to survive brutal cold that could freeze breath in midair. You stand on open land at the edge of the first hard frost. The grass is stiff and silvered. The sky has that pale metallic look that it promises long nights. You pull your wrap a little closer and realise gently that if you tried to face this season with nothing but optimism and a campfire, you probably would not survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And wherever you are in the world tonight, tell me your location and local time in the comments. It is always comforting to know who else is listening in the dark. Now dim the lights. You let your eyes adjust to the land before you. The wind moves low and steady, not yet violent, but patient. Winter here is not a single storm. It is a season that settles in and refuses to leave, and you begin to understand why so many indigenous communities across North America developed semi-subterranean homes. This is not dramatic survivalism, it is careful accumulated knowledge. A well-established historical fact is that earth-sheltered dwellings were used widely across the continent from the Great Plains to the subarctic long before European arrival. Communities such as the Mandan and Hidatsa on the plains built earth lodges with partially sunken floors, while peoples in colder northern regions created winter houses dug deep into the ground and covered with timber and sod. This was not an occasional experiment. It was a reliable seasonal strategy. You kneel and press your hand into the soil. It's cold at the surface, but when you dig a few inches down, it feels different. The earth holds a steady temperature below the frost line. Even in the worst months, the ground remains far warmer than the air above it. You can almost sense it, a quiet reservoir of stored heat. There is something soothing about that realization. The land itself becomes a partner. You're not fighting winter head-on. You're stepping slightly aside, letting the earth wrap around you like a thick blanket. You walk slowly, scanning the slope. You notice how the wind moves across the rise, how snow will likely drift into certain hollows. Indigenous builders were keen observers of these patterns. They knew that placing a shelter in the wrong depression could invite flooding during a thaw or suffocation during a heavy drift. So you imagine yourself choosing carefully, favouring a gentle incline with natural drainage and some protection from prevailing winds. Scholars still debate whether the earliest underground winter houses in North America developed independently in multiple regions or spread gradually through cultural exchange. What is clear is that communities refined these designs over generations, adapting them to soil-type climate and available materials. This was engineering without blueprints, guided by memory and experience. You crouch and begin to scrape away the top layer of frozen grass. The smell of earth rises damp and mineral. It is oddly comforting, like the scent of a root cellar or a garden after rain. As you dig deeper, the air around you grows still. Even the sound changes. Above ground, the wind whistles. Down here, it softens into a distant hush. One quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into textbooks is that some winter houses were so well insulated that visitors reportedly described them as almost too warm once the fire was lit. Imagine stepping inside from a landscape of ice and finding a space that feels steady and almost cozy. That is not primitive. That is clever thermal management. You pause and sit back on your heels. Already the shallow pit shields you from the wind. The temperature difference is subtle but noticeable. This is the first lesson. Survival is not always about building higher walls. Sometimes it is about lowering yourself a little. You think about the rhythm of life that would revolve around this shelter. Winter on the plains or in the northern forests could stretch for months. Food stores would be precious. Travel would slow, nights would lengthen. The underground home was not only protection from cold, it was the centre of seasonal life. There is a quiet humility in this approach. Instead of declaring dominance over nature, you work with it. The earth becomes insulation. Snow becomes additional cover once it settles over the roof. The very thing that threatens you above ground becomes an extra layer of protection when it rests on packed sod. Historians continue to examine how these structures influence social organisation. Living in a semi-subterranean lodge often meant shared space. Families gathered around a central hearth. Sleeping platforms lined the walls. Smoke filtered upward through a roof opening. The design shaped daily routines and even storytelling traditions. Long winter evenings encouraged oral history, craftwork, and teaching. You brush soil from your hands and imagine the first real snow. It comes quietly at dusk, flakes drifting down without urgency. The roof of your imagined shelter is framed with timber layered with brush, then thickly packed with earth. As snow accumulates, it seals small gaps and dampens outside sound. Inside the world feels contained, safe, almost womb-like. And yet nothing about this is lazy comfort. It is constant maintenance. Fire must be tended carefully, ventilation must be balanced. Too little airflow and smoke thickens. Too much and warmth escapes. People learned by watching how smoke curled and clung to the ceiling before slipping out through the smoke hole. It was an art form shaped by daily attention. You lie back for a moment in the shallow excavation and look up at the sky. The blue is fading toward indigo. A thin crescent moon appears. It is beautiful, yes, but beauty does not keep you warm. Planning does. There is a steady wisdom in that thought. Modern houses rely on hidden systems. Furnaces hum behind walls. Insulation is measured in neat numbers. But here you measure comfort by feel, by the way your breath no longer fogs so thickly, by how your fingers stop stinging, by the quiet that settles when wind can no longer find you. As darkness deepens, you picture the full shelter taking shape. Poles arch overhead like ribs. Earth presses down in a protective layer. Inside, the fire glows low and steady. The smell of wood smoke mingles with packed soil. The air is warm enough that you can relax your shoulders. You realize something gentle and important. Surviving brutal winters was not about dramatic last stands against the elements. It was about accumulated knowledge passed hand to hand, season to season. A child growing up in such a lodge would learn early how to seal a draft with a handful of grass, how to read frost patterns on the doorway, how to listen for the subtle shift of wind. You close your eyes and let the imagined warmth settle around you. Outside, winter gathers strength. Inside, you are already planning. And in that quiet planning, you find the beginning of real comfort. The land is cold, yes, but it is also patient, and you are learning to be patient with it. You wake before the sun fully rises and the cold has sharpened overnight. The frost on the grass looks thicker, almost opaque, as if the land has been dipped in glass. You step carefully, feeling how the ground shifts beneath your weight. Today is not about digging yet. Today is about reading the land as if it were a quiet map spread at your feet. You walk the perimeter of the area you chose yesterday. A gentle slope rolls downward toward a line of trees. Beyond that, a small stream curves like a silver thread through the pale field. You pause and watch the wind. It does not move randomly. It favors a direction brushing consistently from the northwest. You turn your face into it and let the chill bite your cheeks. That steady pattern matters more than you might think. A well-documented historical observation is that many Native American winter shelters were oriented with entrances facing away from prevailing winter winds. This simple choice reduced drafts and prevented snow from blowing directly into the doorway. It sounds obvious to us now, but it required long-term awareness of seasonal wind behavior. You imagine generations noticing the same pattern year after year, quietly adjusting their building sites. You crouch and run your hand along the ground again. The soil here feels firm but not rocky. A little farther down slope you notice patches where water once pooled during warmer months. The grass is slightly different there, more sparse. You frown gently. Building in that dip might seem sheltered at first glance, but when the spring thaw arrives, meltwater could seep into your floor. Winter survival includes planning for the end of winter. Historians still argue whether site selection traditions were guided primarily by spiritual considerations, practical observation, or a seamless blend of both. In many communities, landscape was never just terrain. It held meaning, stories, and memory. Yet even within that worldview, practicality ruled the final decision. A shelter that flooded or collapsed would not honor anyone. You straighten and listen. The sound of the wind shifts as it moves across the trees. Where the slope rises slightly, you notice a natural windbreak formed by a cluster of shrubs. Snow would likely drift there, but not pile directly on a doorway if you position it carefully. You can almost picture the entrance tucked into the side of the slope, low and discreet. One curious detail recorded in some ethnographic accounts is that certain groups deliberately chose sites that were less visible from a distance, even in winter, when leaves were gone. It was not only about warmth, it was about safety. A semi-subterranean shelter, especially one built into a slope blended with the land. From afar it might look like nothing more than a gentle mound. The landscape kept its secrets. You take a slow breath and imagine a heavy snowstorm sweeping across this field. Snow falls sideways, driven by wind. If your entrance faces the wrong direction, drifts could rise high enough to block it entirely. You picture yourself waking to a door packed solid with ice. That is not a pleasant thought. So you pivot, aligning your imaginary doorway toward the southeast, away from the harshest gusts. You notice something else. The sun, low in winter, arcs shallowly across the southern sky. If your entrance and smoke opening catch even a few hours of weak sunlight, the interior will brighten slightly and perhaps gain a touch of passive warmth. It is not dramatic, but every small advantage matters. There is a gentle satisfaction in this process. You are not fighting the season with bravado. You are negotiating with it, adjusting angles and positions like a careful chess player. The land offers clues and you respond. A broadly accepted fact among archaeologists is that evidence of ancient semi-subterranean dwellings often appears as circular depressions or soil discolorations in areas with good drainage and site elevation. Even centuries later, the imprint of wise site choice remains visible to trained eyes. You imagine future researchers studying the faint outline of your shelter, reading the soil like a diary. You walk closer to the trees and test the ground again. Roots twist beneath the surface, making digging harder. However, the proximity to timber would make gathering poles easier later. There is always a trade-off. Dig where soil is soft or build where materials are close. Many communities balance these factors by selecting a spot not too far from wood, but not so entangled that excavationists became exhausting. Scholars continue to examine how environmental variation shaped regional differences in shelter design. In the subarctic, deeper excavation provided greater insulation against extreme cold. On the plains where timber could be scarce, builders relied on driftwood along rivers or carefully managed woodland areas. Your choice here must reflect what surrounds you. You kneel and scoop up a handful of soil, squeezing it gently. It clumps slightly, holding shape. That suggests a mix of clay and loam, good for packing into firm walls later. If the soil were too sandy, it might crumble. Too much clay and it could crack when dry. You appreciate how much knowledge is contained in this simple squeeze of earth. The air grows brighter as the sun climbs, though it offers little warmth. Your breath still fogs in front of you. You imagine how a completed shelter would change that sensation. Step inside and the air would feel still. Your lungs would not sting with each inhale. There is something almost meditative about choosing the exact spot. You walk in a slow circle, marking a rough outline with your heel. Not too large so heat remains concentrated. Not too small so there is room for sleeping platforms and storage. You picture family members moving within it, tending a fire, whispering stories while snow presses against the roof above. One lesser-known anecdote mentions that some winter houses were intentionally built near previous year sites reusing partially collapsed structures as insulation or foundation. Practical recycling long before the word existed. You smile softly at the thought. Even in the past, efficiency mattered. You stand finally at a place that feels right. Slightly elevated, shielded from the worst wind, near enough to timber, but not tangled in roots, safe from pooling water. The land here seems to nod in quiet approval. You press your boot into the soil once more, marking the centre. This is where the pit will begin. This is where you will lower yourself into steadier air. The decision feels calm and deliberate, not rushed. Winter hums around you, patient and unyielding. But you have read its signals. You have chosen your ground. And as you prepare to dig, you feel less like an outsider in this cold landscape and more like someone who understands its quiet instructions. You begin with your hands, even though you know they will not be enough. The soil is cold but workable, and you scrape away the top layer, carefully setting aside clumps of grass and roots. The motion is steady, rhythmic. Dig, lift, place. Dig, lift, place. After a few minutes, your fingers ache, and you understand why tools matter. A widely recognized historical fact is that many Native American communities crafted digging implements from materials close at hand. Shoulder blades of large animals were shaped into scoops. Stout sticks were hardened in fire to create durable digging staffs. Stone adzes and bone tools helped cut roots and loosen compacted soil. These were not elaborate devices, but they were efficient and perfectly suited to the task. You imagine holding a bison scapula, its smooth curve fitting naturally against your palm. The edge sharpened just enough slices through the earth with a satisfying resistance. There is something intimate about using a tool that once belonged to an animal that fed and clothed your community. Nothing wasted, nothing ornamental without purpose. You shift your weight and press the tool into the soil. The sound changes from the soft whisper of grass to the dull scrape of packed dirt. It is not dramatic. There is no heroic music, just the steady rhythm of labor. You feel warmth rising in your shoulders despite the cold air. Historians continued to discuss how tool design varied across regions and whether some certain innovations spread through trade networks or emerged independently. What seems certain is that practicality guided evolution. A digging stick that snapped easily would not survive long in use. A blade that dulled quickly would be reshaped or replaced. Over time, only the most reliable form endured. You pause to examine the soil again. Thus, a stubborn root blocks your progress. Instead of forcing it, you reach for a stone adze, carefully cutting around it. Patience saves energy. That is a quiet rule of winter preparation. Waste no strength. You will need it later. One lesser-known detail from archaeological findings is that some digging tools show clear signs of repeated sharpening and repair, suggesting they were valued possessions, not disposable items. You picture a tool passed from elder to youth, its handle worn smooth by years of use. That kind of continuity carries knowledge within it. As the pit deepens even by a few inches, the wind at your back feels less intrusive. You notice the subtle difference immediately. The earth around you begins to form a shallow bowl, blocking some of the gusts. The temperature shift is slight but encouraging. You set aside loosened soil in a neat ring. Later, this very earth will become part of the roof and walls. Nothing is thrown away carelessly. You are shaping not just a hole, but the foundation of insulation. A well-documented observation in studies of semi-subterranean dwellings is that excavation depth varied depending on climate and soil stability. In milder winter regions, shelters might be only partially sunken. In harsher northern climates, homes were dug deeper to take advantage of the ground's stable temperature. You imagine adjusting your depth based on how long and severe the season will be. Your breathing steadies into a calm rhythm. Inhale, press, lift, exhale. There is comfort in repetition. The earth yields slowly but consistently. You feel your muscles working but not straining. This is sustainable effort. You glance toward the tree line, considering the next phase. Poles will need to be cut and shaped, but first the cavity must be right. You measure it with your steps, pacing the diameter carefully. Too wide and heat disperses. Too narrow and movement becomes awkward. Balance is everything. Scholars still debate whether communal labour was always required for these excavations, or if smaller family units sometimes managed the work alone. Ethnographic records suggest both occurred depending on group size and urgency. You imagine neighbours joining in, laughing softly, exchanging stories while tools scrape earth. Labour becomes social, almost soothing. You wipe sweat from your brow despite the chill. It surprises you how quickly digging warms the body. The cold air on your neck feels sharper now against heated skin. You slow your pace slightly, conserving energy. There is no rush. Winter is coming, but panic serves no one. You examine the walls of the pit. The soil holds firm, compact, but not brittle. You smooth the sides with the flat of your tool, shaping a gentle curve rather than a sharp angle. Rounded walls resist collapse better. Even small details matter. A curious anecdote mentioned in some accounts describes children being given miniature digging sticks to imitate adults learning technique through play long before winter demanded real work. You smile at the image of small hands scooping dirt, absorbing knowledge without formal instruction. Skills were not taught in lectures. They were lived. The pit now reaches to your knees. You step inside and stand at the center. The wind sounds different here, muted, distant. It is as if you have lowered the volume of the world. You close your eyes briefly and feel the calm that comes from being partially embraced by earth. A mainstream archaeological finding shows that many ancient semi-subterranean homes reveal clear post holes around their perimeter, evidence of the wooden supports that would later anchor the roof. You picture those posts rising from the edge of your excavation, forming the ribs of the shelter. But for now, your focus remains on the ground itself. You adjust the floor slightly, ensuring it slopes gently toward one side for drainage. Even in winter, melted snow or spilled water must have somewhere to go. Neglect that detail and dampness creeps in. You run your hand across the packed floor. It feels cool but steady. This will soon be layered with mats and hides, raised sleeping platforms along the edge. You imagine lying there, listening to wind glide over the roof above, feeling secure. The sun begins to lower again, casting long shadows across the field. You climb out of the pit and look down at your work. It is not yet a shelter. It is simply a beginning, but it feels solid. Tools rest beside you, simple and unpretentious. Bone, wood, stone, they do not glitter. They do not boast. Yet without them, this protective hollow would remain an idea rather than reality. You gather them, carefully brushing soil from their surfaces. Respect for tools is respect for survival. Each scrape of earth today is an investment in warmth tomorrow. The wind picks up slightly as dusk approaches, but you feel less exposed now. There is a shape in the ground that did not exist this morning. A promise carved into soil. You take one last look at the shallow excavation before turning away for the night. Tomorrow the walls will deepen and the structure will begin to rise. But already you understand something simple and profound. Survival here is not about grand gestures. It is about steady hands, Tembesan's well-shaped tools, and the quiet wisdom to use them. You return to the pit as a morning light spills gently across the frost. The ground looks different today, slightly darker, where yesterday's digging exposed damp layers beneath the surface. You step inside the shallow excavation and feel the air settle around you, again calmer than the open field above. It is time to understand the earth more deeply, not just as something to remove but as something to read. You kneel and press your palm flat against the wall. The soil here feels dense, cool, and faintly sticky. Clay threads through it, binding particles together. Oh, that's a gift. Soil with enough clay will hold its shape when carved carefully. Too much sand and the wall might crumble. Too much pure clay and drying cracks could form later. You're not just digging, you are testing a partnership. Archaeological research consistently shows that indigenous builders were attentive to soil composition, often selecting sites where the earth would remain structurally stable throughout winter. In regions where loose or sandy soil dominated, shelters relied more heavily on wooden frameworks and thicker external coverings. Where compact loam or clay prevailed, the walls themselves could serve as part of the support system. You scrape gently at a section and notice a few small stones embedded within. They resist your tool with a soft clink. You work around them rather than forcing them free. Removing every obstacle would waste strength. Instead, you smooth the wall so the stones sit flush harmless within the curve. There is a faint smell rising from the deeper soil mineral and slightly sweet. It reminds you of riverbanks in late summer. Even as frost stiffens the surface, the deeper layers remain steady, insulated from the sharpest air. This constancy is why you are here. Some researchers continue to examine whether certain communities intentionally mix soil types during construction, adding more clay to sandy areas to strengthen walls. Evidence suggests that in some places builders carried baskets of different earth to reinforce weak sections. It was not random effort, it was deliberate engineering guided by touch and observation. You crouch lower and examine the floor. The uppermost layer is loose from yesterday's work. You tamp it gently with the flat of your tool, compacting it. A firm floor reduces dust and holds warmth more effectively. You imagine layering reeds or mats, later creating a barrier between body and ground. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic accounts notes that in some regions, builders lined interior walls with woven mats before adding packed earth, creating a flexible layer that reduced cracking. The idea feels ingenious. A cushion between rigid materials allows for slight movement without failure. You widen the pit, gradually shaving thin layers from the wall. The shape becomes more rounded, almost bowl-like. Sharp corners trap cold air and create weak stress points. A curved interior encourages even distribution of pressure from the roof and soil above. The wind hums faintly overhead, but here you are in a pocket of relative quiet. You can hear your own breathing clearly. Inhale, scrape, exhale, smooth. It becomes almost hypnotic. Historical documentation from Lane's communities describes earth lodge floors sunk several feet below ground level, sometimes as much as 3 or 4 feet depending on need. That depth provided substantial insulation and allowed roof beams to rest securely on the perimeter. You picture standing fully inside such a space, only the roof visible above the surface, the rest embraced by soil. You pause and inspect a section where the earth looks slightly crumbly. The colour shifts from dark brown to a lighter tone. That could indicate a change in composition. You press your thumb into it, testing resistance. It gives way too easily. You decide to carve slightly past that layer, ensuring the main walls consist of stronger soil. Experts still discuss how often trial and error shaped early construction choices. Not every attempt would have been perfect. Collapses likely happened, especially in unfamiliar terrain. Over time, experience would refine instincts. The land taught those willing to observe. A small beetle scurries across the exposed earth, confused by the sudden light. You smile softly. Even in winter's approach, life persists in hidden layers. Your shelter will become another hidden layer, a space of warmth beneath the surface. You smooth the walls again with deliberate strokes. The curve becomes elegant in its simplicity. There is no decoration yet, no carving or embellishment. Function rules this stage. Beauty emerges from proportion and stability. An interesting anecdote preserved in some oral traditions suggests that elders would test a newly dug wall by pressing their weight gently against it, listening for subtle shifts or crumbling sounds. Their bodies served as measuring tools. If the wall held steady under a firm lean, it was deemed trustworthy. You consider doing the same and press your shoulder lightly against the surface. It holds. The floor now reaches slightly deeper near mid-thigh. You step back and evaluate the space. It feels more enclosed, more intimate. The horizon is no longer fully visible from within. Instead, the sky appears as a narrow band above. Academic conversations continue about how different regions adapted to permafrost conditions where digging deep was nearly impossible during certain months. In such cases, builders often prepared sites in warmer seasons, allowing winter occupation without fresh excavation. Planning stretched across the calendar, not just a few urgent days before snowfall. You brush loose soil toward the outer ring again. This earth will not be wasted. Later it will mound around the exterior ceiling seams and thickening insulation. Every scoop removed now becomes protection later. Your arms feel pleasantly tired. There is a warmth spreading through your back from steady motion. The cold air that once stung your face feels less intrusive when you rise briefly above the pit's edge. You glance toward the trees again, imagining the roof structure that will soon arch overhead. But you remind yourself not to rush. The foundation must be sound. A flawed base compromises everything above it. You take a final moment to run your fingers across the interior curve. It feels cool, firm, reliable. This hollow in the earth is becoming something intentional. It is no longer just a hole. It is a carefully shaped cavity designed to cradle heat and shelter life. As the day wanes, the light softens to gold, shadows stretch long across the field. You climb out slowly and look back down. The pit seems deeper than it did an hour ago, though the change is measured, not dramatic. There is comfort in slow progress. Winter is relentless, yes, but it is predictable. And predictability allows preparation. You have listened to the soil. You have shaped it with patience. Tomorrow, the bones of the shelter will begin to rise from this steady foundation. For now, you leave the earth smooth and curved, ready to support what comes next. You step down into the deepened pit and feel the air settle around you like a held breath. The walls are smooth now, curved and compact, and the floor sits firmly beneath your boots. The hollow feels intentional, almost expectant. Today you begin shaping it not just as a cavity in the earth, but as a chamber that understands heat. Does warmth. Cold air sinks and warm air does warmth. Cold air sinks and warm air rises, but in a shallow open space the wind steals it before it can gather. Here the wind has lost its grip. A commonly accepted historical observation is that semi-subterranean dwellings could maintain temperatures significantly warmer than the outside air during winter months, sometimes by dozens of degrees once a fire was established. The insulating quality of surrounding soil reduced heat loss and stabilized interior conditions. You picture a blizzard raging above while inside the air remains steady and breathable. You kneel and begin refining the shape of the floor. It is not perfectly flat. Instead, you create a subtle slope toward one side, barely noticeable but purposeful. Any spilled water or melted snow must flow away from sleeping areas. Dampness is a quiet enemy in winter. It chills slowly, creeping into bones without drama. You imagine placing the hearth slightly off-center, not directly in the middle. The fire must warm the interior evenly without sending soak directly into the roof supports. Position matters. A fire too close to a wall could weaken structural beams over time. Too close to the doorway, and warmth escapes easily. Researchers continued to examine how interior layouts varied across cultures, particularly the placement of hearths and ventilation openings. Some evidence suggests carefully calculated positioning that balanced airflow and heat retention. You're not guessing blindly. You are drawing on generations of quiet experimentation. You scoop out a shallow depression where the hearth will sit, not deep enough to trap heat entirely, but low enough to contain embers safely. The smell of disturbed earth rises again, grounding and steady. You press the soil firm around the edges of this small basin, imagining glowing coals resting there one day. An intriguing detail from historical accounts mentions that certain communities lined their hearth areas with flat stones to reflect heat and prevent excessive erosion of the floor. Stone absorbs warmth during the fire's strongest hours and releases it slowly after flames diminish. You picture gathering smooth river stones for this purpose, placing them with care. You rise and walk the perimeter of the interior. Along the edges you begin shaping slight ledges, raised platforms where bedding will eventually rest. Sleeping directly on the floor draws cold upward into the body. Elevation matters, even if only by a few inches. That small difference can transform a restless night into restorative rest. Scholars continue to debate how standardized these interior features were. Did every shelter follow a familiar template, or did families adjust designs to personal preference and local condition? The answer likely varies. What remains consistent is the intention behind each decision. Warmth, dryness, and safety guided the design. You smooth the ledges, carefully pressing down loose soil with deliberate strokes. You imagine woven mats spread across them, then animal hides layered above. The scent of tanned leather, faint and comforting, mingles with wood smoke in your mind. The air inside the pit feels noticeably calmer now. Even before a roof rises, the walls block much of the wind. You climb out briefly and stand above ground, feeling the cold sweep across your shoulders. Then you step back down and experience the difference again. It is subtle but undeniable. The earth cradles you. A fascinating tidbit preserved in oral histories suggests that children sometimes referred to winter houses as the earth's embrace, a place where stories felt louder and outside sounds faded. Whether literal or poetic, the description captures something true about acoustics and atmosphere underground. You sit for a moment on one of the newly shaped platforms. The soil is cool but not biting. You close your eyes and imagine a small fire glowing in the hearth depression. The heat would rise gently, pooling beneath the roof before circulating outward. The curved walls would reflect warmth inward rather than letting it scatter. Modern thermal studies of earth-sheltered buildings confirm what indigenous builders understood intuitively. Soil acts as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during warmer periods and releasing it gradually when temperatures drop. You do not need scientific instruments to feel this. Your skin already senses the difference. You adjust the angle of the hearth slightly, considering airflow. Smoke must find a path upward through a roof opening without lingering too long inside. Too much smoke irritates lungs and eyes. Too little ventilation and embers smoulder poorly. Balance again defines survival. Researchers still explore how ventilation techniques evolved, particularly in regions with extreme cold where large openings risked heat loss. Some winter houses featured entry tunnels that acted as cold air traps, preventing frigid gusts from sweeping directly into the main chamber. You imagine such a tunnel extending from your future doorway, low and angled. For now, you mark the area where that entrance will eventually be carved. It sits slightly below the main floor level, ensuring cold air settles there instead of spreading across sleeping areas. It feels almost mathematical in its precision. You run your hand along the wall once more. The surface is firm and smooth. There is a quiet beauty in its simplicity. No decoration yet, no carved patterns, just function shaped by necessity. Above, the sky has turned pale again. The season presses forward with steady confidence. You glance at the ring of soil piled outside, imagining it packed thickly over the roof beam soon. Snow will layer on top of that, adding even more insulation. You feel a small surge of satisfaction. This hollow is no longer merely a shelter site. It is becoming a system. Heat will gather here. Breath will soften here. Stories will unfold here while wind and frost patrol the world above. You stand slowly and step out of the pit, brushing soil from your palms. The air feels sharper on your face now, as if reminding you why you're doing this work. You look back down at the shaped interior, at the hearth depression and raised sleeping ledges. It feels ready for the next stage. The bones of the shelter must rise soon, but already the heart of it is forming below ground. And in that quiet, carefully carved space, you sense the promise of warmth, waiting patiently for flame. You stand at the edge of the pit and look toward the trees, knowing that the shelter now needs a skeleton. The earth has offered its embrace, but it cannot hold a roof on its own. The structure above will carry weight, especially when winter snow settles thick and heavy across the top. Today is about raising ribs over the hollow you have shaped so carefully. You walk into the tree line and study the trunks. Straight saplings are best sturdy yet flexible. You run your hand along the bark of one young tree, feeling its firmness. Not too thick or it becomes unwieldy. Not too thin or it bends under pressure. Selection is quiet judgment guided by experience rather than haste. Ethnographic records consistently describe the use of locally available timber for the framing of semi-subterranean homes. On the plains, cottonwood often served this purpose along river valleys. In forested regions, spruce or other conifers were common. Builders chose what the land provided, adapting design to material rather than forcing uniformity. You imagine cutting the sapling with a stone tool, patient strokes at the base until it yields. The sound is steady and rhythmic, not violent. When it falls, it does so with a soft thud into frost-stiffened grass. You trim branches carefully, shaping a smooth pole. Carrying it back toward the pit, you feel the weight across your shoulders. It is not unbearable, but it demands attention. Winter shelters were rarely built alone in reality. Community labour eased this burden. Yet you imagine yourself managing it step by deliberate step. Some researchers continue to explore how communal construction strengthened social bonds during late autumn. Building together was not only efficient but symbolic a shared commitment to collective survival. The act of raising beams over a shared space reinforced cooperation long before snow began to fall. You lower the first pole into position. Along the rim of the excavation, a shallow notch carved into the soil holds its base steady. You tilt it inward slightly so it angles toward the center. Soon several such poles will lean together, forming a conical or domed frame depending on regional style. Archaeological findings frequently reveal circular arrangements of post holes around ancient lodge sites, confirming the presence of sturdy vertical supports. These posts anchored the weight of crossbeams and roof layers. You picture future excavators discovering the faint ring left by your careful placements. You retrieve another pole and set it opposite the first, angling it inward. Gradually the shape emerges. The pit below feels smaller as the structure rises above it. The sky, once wide and open, now appears framed by wood. An intriguing observation from historical accounts mentions that builders sometimes selected a central support beam thicker than the others, symbolizing stability. In some traditions, that central post held spiritual significance as well as structural importance. Whether symbolic or purely practical, the thicker beam provided reassurance. You step back and examine the spacing between poles. Too far apart and the roof sags under snow. Too close and unnecessary weight complicates construction. Balance again becomes your guide. You adjust one slightly, pressing its base deeper into firm soil. Scholars continue to examine how roof pitch varied depending on expected snowfall. In regions with heavy accumulation, steeper angles allowed snow to slide away more easily. Flatter roofs required stronger beams to bear the load. You tilt your poles enough to encourage runoff while keeping interior height comfortable. You lash the upper ends together with cordage made from plant fibers or strips of hide. The binding must be tight but flexible, allowing slight movement under pressure without snapping. As you pull the cord snug, you feel the structure begin to hold itself. A lesser-known detail from some plains accounts suggests that women often played a central role in lodge construction, particularly in arranging coverings and interior features. Labour division was not rigidly defined by strength alone, but by skill and experience. You imagine hands working in quiet coordination, passing poles, tightening bindings, checking alignment. With the primary ribs in place, you add crosspieces, weaving them horizontally between vertical supports. This lattice distributes weight evenly and provides a base for brush and earth layers to come. Each piece fits into the growing framework like a puzzle solved without written instructions. You climb carefully into the pit and look upward through the forming dome. The pattern of intersecting poles creates a geometric canopy against the pale sky. It feels protective already, even before coverings are added. A widely accepted architectural principle observed in many indigenous earth lodges is the use of a central smoke opening at the roof's apex. You leave a deliberate gap at the top, framing it with care. It must be large enough to vent smoke, yet small enough to retain warmth. Precision matters here more than anywhere else. Some historians still question how consistently smoke hole sizes were standardized across regions, given variations in fire size and climate. What remains clear is that ventilation required constant adjustment, often through movable coverings or interior flaps. Flexibility defined success. You test the frame gently by pressing against one of the ribs. It yields slightly, then settles. The movement reassures you. A rigid structure might crack under shifting snow. Slight flexibility allows resilience. The afternoon light filters through the lattice, casting soft patterns onto the earthen floor below. The pit feels less exposed now, more intimate. You imagine how brush will soon weave across these ribs, followed by thick layers of sod and soil. There is a faint creak as wood adjusts to new tension. The sound is not alarming, only alive. Timber breathes as it settles. You listen closely, attuned to subtle shifts. You climb out and circle the structure, examining it from every angle. The frame appears balanced, symmetrical without being mechanical. It rises modestly above ground, not towering but sufficient. One fascinating anecdote describes how some builders would pause after raising the frame to share a simple meal within the unfinished structure, marking the transition from open pit to emerging home. The gesture reinforced the idea that this space already belonged to the community. You imagine sitting inside now, even without coverings, feeling the promise of enclosure. The sky deepens toward evening once more. Frost begins to gather again along the field's edges. You place your hand on one of the wooden ribs and feel its cool solidity. The bones of your shelter stand ready. Soon they will carry layers of insulation, turning this open framework into a sealed refuge. But even now, beneath this skeletal dome, you sense the quiet shift from vulnerability toward protection. The earth below and the wood above are working together. And as you step back and watch the silhouette against fading light, you realize that winter's challenge has been answered not with defiance, but with thoughtful construction, one rib at a time. You wake to a pale sky and the faint scent of wood still clinging to your hands. The frame stands steady where you left it, ribs arcing inward over the pit like the curved fingers of a patient hand. Today you begin the quiet art of sealing. The structure may look complete from a distance, but winter does not respect appearances. It searches for gaps, for hairline openings, where warmth slips away unnoticed. You step inside the frame shelter and look upward through the lattice of poles. The sky shows in thin strips between crosspieces. That will not do, you need layers. You gather bundles of brush and long grasses, their stems dry and whispering against one another. As you lift them overhead and weave them across the ribs, the sound softens. The open sky narrows. A widely documented feature of earth-sheltered homes across several regions is the use of organic materials such as brush reeds, bark and woven mats as intermediate layers before soil was added. These materials acted as insulation and helped prevent loose dirt from sifting down into the living space. You imagine hands working steadily, tucking each bundle into place. You press the brush firmly between ribs so it does not shift. The texture is prickly against your fingers, but it fills space effectively. You move slowly around the dome, layering material evenly. Already the interior feels dimmer, more enclosed. Sound from outside becomes muted. Some researchers continue to explore how thick these organic layers typically were. The answer likely depended on climate and available resources. In harsher conditions, thicker insulation offered greater protection. What remains consistent is the attention to detail. Small gaps left unattended could become steady drafts. You climb out and begin packing the excavated soil over the brush layer. Each shovelful lands with a soft thud spreading across the dome. You use the flat of your tool to smooth and press it into place. The soil settles into the brush beneath, creating a dense covering. An intriguing detail from Plains Earth lodges describes how sod blocks were sometimes cut in rectangular pieces and stacked carefully over the roof grass side down, forming a thick insulating blanket. The roots interlocked, reducing erosion and strengthening the surface. You picture slicing such blocks, fitting them like quiet puzzle pieces. You circle the structure, adding soil evenly to prevent imbalance. Too much weight on one side could strain the ribs beneath. You listen for creaks, for subtle shifts and roll in the frame. It responds with low murmurs but holds steady. The wind picks up briefly, brushing across the newly layered roof. You watch closely. The surface remains firm. Loose soil that scatters must be pressed more tightly. You return to smooth it, packing edges carefully where the dome meets the ground. Ethnographic accounts often note that the exterior of earth lodges blended naturally with surrounding terrain once completed. Grass sometimes regrew across the packed soil, further anchoring it. From a distance, the structure resembled a gentle rise rather than a built form. You appreciate that subtlety. Protection does not need to announce itself. You return inside and notice the difference immediately. The air feels heavier, calmer. Even without a fire, the chill seems less sharp. The brush and soil above create a barrier that quiets the wind to a distant murmur. A question scholars still examine is how often these coverings were repaired throughout winter. Snow, ice and thaw cycles could loosen sections. Maintenance was likely ongoing, small adjustments made after storms to preserve integrity. A shelter was not a one-time project, but a living system requiring care. You move to the area marked for the entrance and begin shaping the opening more deliberately. It must remain low, forcing anyone who enters to stoop slightly. That bend in posture is not accidental. A lower entrance traps cold air near the floor and reduces heat escape. One lesser-known observation suggests that some winter homes featured short entry tunnels extending outwards, sometimes covered with additional brush and earth. These acted as buffers against wind, creating a small chamber where cold air settled before reaching the main interior. You imagine adding such a passage in time. You check the smoke opening at the top. It remains clear, framed by sturdy beams. You add a light layer of brush around its edges without closing it entirely. Later adjustable coverings will help regulate airflow. The afternoon light filters faintly through the smoke hole, now casting a soft circle onto the earthen floor. The interior glows gently rather than glaring. You sit for a moment on the raised sleeping platform and listen. Outside, the wind brushes across soil and grass. Inside, the sound feels distant, almost irrelevant. Historical studies of thermal performance in reconstructed earth lodges demonstrate that thick soil coverings significantly reduced heat loss compared to above-ground wooden structures alone. The mass of earth stored warmth from even modest fires. You picture embers glowing in the hearth, depression, heat rising and meeting the insulated roof before circulating downward again. You run your hand along the interior wall. It feels firm and slightly cool, but not biting. You imagine how after several days of steady fire these walls would warm, subtly holding residual heat through the night. There is something deeply satisfying about the smell inside now. Earth-dry grass, faint wood sap. It smells grounded, secure. You take a slow breath and let it settle in your lungs. Researchers continue to discuss how insulation techniques varied depending on resource availability. In treeless areas, reliance on sod and earth was even greater. In forested regions, bark and additional timber layers supplemented the design. Flexibility again defined survival. You stand and walk once more around the interior, scanning for light leaks or drafts. A thin ray slips through near one rib. You climb out and add another handful of soil, pressing it firmly into the seam. Attention to small details prevents large discomfort later. The sky dims toward evening. Frost begins to creep across the field once more. You step inside the nearly sealed shelter and crouch at the hearth depression. You place a few small sticks there, imagining flame rising gently. The structure feels complete in its enclosure now. The world outside is colder, sharper. Inside you sense the beginning of steadiness. You sit quietly on the raised platform back against the curved wall. The air holds stillness like a cupped hand. The shelter does not shout its strength. It simply exists, layered and thoughtful, ready to hold warmth when you give it flame. And as you listen to the fading wind beyond thickened walls, you realize that sealing is not only about blocking cold, it is about creating quiet. Quiet where breath softens, where stories can unfold, where winter's harsh voice becomes a distant whisper. You stand at the edge of the entrance opening and feel the wind brush across your back. The shelter behind you is nearly complete, layered and sealed, but this threshold remains imposed. The doorway is more than a gap in the wall. It is the meeting point between winter's sharp breath and the steady air you have created inside. You crouch and study the angle carefully. The opening is low, requiring a person to bend as they enter. That detail is intentional. Cold air travels low along the ground. By keeping the entrance narrow and close to the earth, you limit how much of that cold can rush inward. You begin shaping the passage more deliberately, smoothing its sides and slightly deepening the small trench that leads inside. Ethnographic documentation from various plains and subarctic communities confirms that many winter houses featured recessed or angled entrances, often facing away from dominant winter winds. This was not decorative architecture. It was functional physics refined over generations of observation. You imagine countless winters teaching the same quiet lesson. You gather additional brush and begin constructing a short tunnel that extends outward from the main opening. The tunnel does not need to be long, only enough to create a pocket where frigid air can settle before reaching the central chamber. You press soil along the outer surface, sealing the structure until it blends with the surrounding ground. Some researchers continue to investigate how entry tunnels evolved regionally. In colder northern climates, longer and more pronounced passageways appear in archaeological evidence. In milder regions, shorter and simpler entries sufficed. Adaptation reflects climate rather than rigid tradition. You crawl slowly through the forming tunnel, testing its width. Your shoulders brush the sides, but there is enough space. The act of stooping forces you into a humble posture, a small bow to the shelter itself. Once inside, you straighten and feel the air shift around you. The tunnel has already softened the draft. There is a subtle psychological effect in this design as well. The world outside feels distant once you pass through the narrow passage. The low ceiling and curved walls encourage quiet voices. Sound dampens naturally. Historical accounts indicate that some communities placed hides or woven mats over the entrance during the coldest nights, further reducing airflow. These coverings could be adjusted easily, allowing more ventilation when needed. You picture lifting a thick hide at dawn, letting pale light spill into the tunnel. Scholars still examine whether entrance orientation carried symbolic meaning, in addition to practical considerations. In certain traditions, facing a particular direction held spiritual significance. Yet even when symbolism guided placement, survival needs were never ignored. The two often coexisted seamlessly. You pack soil carefully along the outer curve of the tunnel, reinforcing it against collapse. The roof of the passage rests on smaller poles woven tightly with brush and sealed under earth. It feels sturdy beneath your palm. A curious detail noted in some early observations mentions that smoke from interior fires occasionally drifted outward through the entrance tunnel during calm weather, creating a faint visible thread across the snow. From a distance, it might reveal habitation, but it also demonstrated effective airflow. You imagine that thin ribbon of smoke curling softly in cold air. You step back outside and examine the shelter from a distance. The entrance appears modest, almost hidden against the slope. There is no grand doorway, no imposing facade. Just a subtle opening near ground level. It feels protective rather than defensive. Inside again, you sit near the hearth depression and notice how the tunnel influences air movement. Even without flame, the interior feels less drafty than before. The earth walls absorb and mute the outside chill. Archaeological evidence often reveals wear patterns near ancient doorways, suggesting repeated use and gradual shaping by countless footsteps. You run your hand along the packed soil of your tunnel and imagine it polished over time by movements softened by a familiarity. The sky dims early as clouds gather. You kneel at the entrance and imagine a heavy snow falling overnight. The tunnel's slight downward angle will prevent drifting snow from sliding directly into the chamber. Even if accumulation occurs outside, clearing a short passage will be easier than digging open a wide doorway. Researchers continue to analyze how snow itself served as additional insulation once piled against the exterior of earth-covered shelters. Snow may appear hostile, but when resting quietly atop thick soil, it adds another protective layer. The entrance must remain functional within that dynamic. You test the height again, stooping and stepping through slowly. The movement becomes instinctive. Enter, bend, rise, exit, bend, step out. Repetition builds comfort. One fascinating anecdote preserved in some community histories describes children delighting in the low tunnel, during winter viewing it almost as a secret passage into warmth. For them, the narrow entry was not inconvenience, but part of the shelter's character. You sit just inside the threshold and listen. Outside wind brushes faintly across the field. Inside the air remains calm. The difference is subtle but reassuring. The doorway now serves its purpose. It limits exposure without sealing you off entirely. It respects airflow while guarding warmth. It reminds you that survival often depends on thoughtful transitions rather than rigid barriers. You place your hand on the packed earth beside the entrance and feel its firmness. The tunnel feels like a quiet guardian standing between harshness and comfort. As twilight deepens, you retreat fully inside and let the darkness settle. The shelter feels more complete than ever before. Earth above walls around tunnel behind you. The boundary between outside and inside is defined clearly yet gently. And as you imagine the first real storm pressing against that small entrance, you sense confidence rising. Winter may search for weakness, but here at the threshold you have answered it with patience and careful design. You sit beside the shallow hearth depression and study it as if it were a living thing waiting to wake. The shelter is sealed. The entrance tunnel stands ready. The roof above is thick with brush and earth. Now you turn to the quiet power that will make this space truly livable. Fire. You gather small twigs, first dry and brittle, snapping cleanly between your fingers. Then you add slightly thicker sticks, arranging them carefully within the hearth basin. The depression is not deep, but it is defined enough to contain embers safely. You strike a spark and coax the first flame into being. It catches slowly, then brightens. A thin ribbon of smoke curls upward, rising towards the smoke opening at the top of the dome. You watch it closely. Smoke behavior tells you whether your design works. It drifts upward, hesitates briefly beneath the roof, then slips through the opening in a steady stream. A well-established observation in studies of earth lodges is that ventilation required constant attention. Builders often adjusted the size of the smoke hole with coverings of hide or bark depending on wind direction and fire intensity. Too wide an opening allowed heat to escape rapidly. Too narrow and smoke gathered inside. You feed the fire gently, adding a thicker branch. The flames glow warmer, reflecting against the curved walls. The interior light shifts from grey to amber. Shadows flicker softly along the packed earth. Researchers continue to explore how indigenous communities mastered airflow in enclosed spaces without modern chimneys. Some evidence suggests subtle architectural adjustments, including slight roof angles or interior deflectors that guided smoke upward more efficiently. You feel that knowledge in your bones as you observe the flow. The air inside warms gradually. It does not surge in temperature. Instead, it rises steadily like water filling a basin. You extend your hands toward the flame and feel warmth spreading across your fingers. An intriguing detail from certain historical accounts mentions that fires in winter houses were often kept low and steady rather than large and roaring. A modest flame conserved fuel and maintained consistent warmth. Large fires consumed resources quickly and produced excessive smoke. Moderation was wisdom. You shift slightly and notice how the curved walls reflect heat inward. The soil above acts as a thick barrier, trapping warmth inside the chamber. Even the floor beneath you begins to lose its sharp chill. Scholars still examine how fuel choices varied across regions. In forested areas, seasoned wood was abundant. On the plains, dried bison dung sometimes served as an alternative fuel source, burning steadily with minimal smoke when properly dried. It may sound surprising, but practicality outweighed modern sensibilities. You adjust the fire, slightly spreading embers so they burn evenly. The smoke continues its steady ascent. You observe how a small gust outside causes a brief swirl near the roof opening before stabilizing again. The entrance tunnel helps prevent sudden drafts from disrupting the flame. A broadly recognized fact in archaeological reconstructions is that soot patterns near ancient smoke holes reveal consistent use and effective ventilation. Darkened beams and soil layers tell the story of countless quiet evenings beneath flickering light. You sit back on the raised sleeping platform and feel the temperature shift more clearly now. The air no longer stings your nose, your shoulders relax. The difference between outside and inside becomes dramatic in your imagination. The fire crackles softly, a gentle rhythm that blends with your breathing. There is comfort in that sound. It fills the shelter without overwhelming it. Experts continue to discuss whether certain communities develop specific rituals around lighting the first fire of winter. While practical necessity dominated, symbolic meaning often accompanied the act. Fire marked the transition from preparation to occupation. You lean forward and place a flat stone near the edge of the hearth. It absorbs warmth quickly. Later it will release that stored heat slowly into the air, extending comfort even after flames diminish. A lesser-known anecdote describes how some families arrange their seating and sleeping positions based on proximity to the hearth, with elders often occupying the warmest spots. The shelter's layout reflected both physical need and social structure. You watch as the fire steadies into a consistent glow. Smoke flows cleanly upward. The entrance tunnel remains calm. The interior now holds a gentle warmth that feels almost surprising after days of cold excavation. You close your eyes briefly and listen. Outside wind brushes faintly across the mound of earth. Inside, the crackle of burning wood creates a private world. The walls seem to breathe softly as they absorb and radiate heat. Archaeologists analyzing thermal performance in reconstructed lodges have noted how quickly interior temperatures can rise once a fire is established, especially when insulation layers are thick. What you feel now confirms that principle without measurement tools. You adjust the smoke opening, slightly lowering a small covering to narrow it as the fire stabilizes. The draft improves subtly, pulling smoke upward more efficiently while preserving warmth. There is a balance here that demands awareness. Too much fuel and the air becomes heavy. Too little and the chill creeps back. You learn to read flame color, smoke density, and the feel of air against your skin. Scholars continue to explore how children learned fire tending skills from an early age, observing elders manage embers with careful attention. Knowledge passed quietly through watching and doing rather than formal instruction. You stretch your legs toward the hearth and feel warmth reach your boots. The earth floor beneath begins to lose its earlier coldness. The shelter feels alive now, no longer just structure and insulation, but a living space. The smoke hole above frames a patch of darkening sky. A faint thread of smoke rises into evening air, visible for only a moment before dissolving. You add one final small log and settle back against the curved wall. The fire does not roar, it hums gently, steady and reliable. In this moment you understand something simple yet profound. Underground shelter without fire is potential. Fire within shelter is transformation. Together they create a pocket of calm in a season that tests endurance. And as the warmth spreads slowly through the chamber, you feel winter's edge retreat just a little farther from your skin. You wake to the soft glow of embers still alive in the hearth. The fire did not need to roar through the night. It simply breathed steady and patient like the shelter itself. The air inside feels noticeably different now, not warm in a dramatic way, but balanced. The sharp sting that once lived in your fingertips is gone. You sit up slowly on the raised platform and place your palm against the earthen wall. It feels faintly warmer than it did yesterday. The soil has absorbed heat and now returns it gently. This quiet exchange between fire and earth becomes the heart of winter survival. One well-documented architectural feature in many semi-subterranean homes is the use of elevated sleeping platforms built along the interior walls. These platforms kept bodies off the cold floor and allowed heat rising from the hearth to circulate beneath bedding. You shift your weight and feel how the slight elevation changes everything. The air closer to the floor remains cooler, while higher up it feels noticeably softer. You adjust the layers beneath you, imagining woven reed mats laid first, then thick animal hides above them. The texture is firm but forgiving. Insulation works best in layers. Air trapped between materials slows the escape of warmth. It is a simple principle, but one that makes an enormous difference during long nights. Researchers continue to examine how bedding materials varied across regions. In forested areas, evergreen boughs sometimes formed a springy base beneath mats. On the plains, carefully cured hides served as primary insulation. Choices depended on environment, yet the logic remained consistent. Elevate the body, trap the heat, reduce exposure. You kneel beside the hearth and stir the embers gently, adding a few small sticks to revive the flame. The fire responds quickly, sending a modest glow upward. You watch how the warmth spreads again across the chamber. An intriguing observation from historical descriptions suggests that sleeping arrangements often followed a specific order within the lodge, sometimes reflecting family hierarchy or practical concerns such as proximity to the entrance. The warmest spots might belong to elders or young children. In such spaces, comfort intertwined with social structure. You return to the platform and lie back, pulling a hide across your shoulders. Even without intense flame, the shelter feels protective. The earth above blocks wind entirely. Snow that fell during the night now rests quietly on the roof, adding another insulating layer. Archaeological evidence from excavated winter houses often reveals compacted areas along the walls where repeated use formed subtle depressions. These marks speak of countless nights spent in similar positions, bodies creating memory in soil. You shift your legs and feel how the air circulates gently upward from the hearth. Heat gathers near the roof before drifting downward along the curved walls. The design encourages movement without creating drafts. Scholars still consider how much knowledge of airflow and thermodynamics was consciously understood versus intuitively practiced. Regardless of terminology, the effectiveness of these designs demonstrates a refined understanding of how warm air behaves within enclosed spaces. You sit up again and inspect the bedding more closely. Moisture is the silent threat. If hides grow damp, insulation weakens quickly. You run your fingers across the surface, checking for condensation. The interior remains dry, a sign that ventilation and hearth placement are working together properly. A lesser-known detail preserved in some community narratives mentions that bedding was sometimes aired outside briefly on clear winter days, even in cold temperatures, to prevent moisture buildup. Sunlight and crisp air refreshed materials before they returned to the warmth of the lodge. You step toward the entrance tunnel and notice how the low doorway traps cooler air near the ground. A faint chill lingers there, but it does not climb toward the sleeping platforms. The design functions exactly as intended. Historical accounts of Plains Earth lodges often describe families spending extended winter periods inside, engaging in craftwork, storytelling, and food preparation while storms raged outside. The interior layout supported these activities. Sleeping platforms doubled as seating areas during the day. You sit cross-legged on the platform and imagine small tasks unfolding around you. Hands weaving fibers, voices speaking softly, the fire glowing in the center a constant presence. Researchers continue to explore how interior arrangements shifted seasonally. Some communities used these semi-subterranean dwellings primarily during winter months, returning to lighter structures in warmer seasons. The winter house was not permanent for everyone, but it was essential. You adjust the fire again, spreading embers to maintain a low, steady heat. Fuel must be conserved. Large flames offer brief comfort but consume resources quickly. A steady glow preserves both warmth and wood supply. An interesting anecdote from early observers recounts how visitors entering an earth lodge for the first time were surprised by the comfort inside, especially when compared to the harsh landscape outside. Expectations shaped by above-ground shelters did not prepare them for the thermal efficiency of earth-insulated homes. You recline once more and feel the gradual warmth along your back. The curved wall supports you gently. The scent of smoke is faint, not overwhelming. Air flows cleanly through the smoke opening above. Scholars continue to analyze soot layers found in ancient lodges, noting how consistent fire use over months left distinct patterns. These traces allow modern researchers to estimate how often fires burned and how effectively smoke escaped. You close your eyes briefly and imagine snow piling higher on the roof. Each inch adds weight, but the frame holds steady beneath thick earth. Snow becomes insulation rather than threat. You breathe slowly, noticing how calm the interior feels. The design does not rely on constant activity to remain comfortable. Once established, it supports rest. The raised platform beneath you represents more than convenience. It is a quiet acknowledgement that the ground itself, though protective, still carries cold. Elevation creates separation without abandoning the sheltering embrace of earth. You reach out and touch the packed soil wall again. It feels steady and reassuring. Fire, earth, and careful planning work together to create this balance. Outside, the day brightens faintly beyond the entrance tunnel. Inside, warmth lingers softly against your skin. And as you settle back onto the layered bedding, listening to the low crackle of embers, you realize that survival in winter is not only about resisting cold, it is about creating small zones of comfort raised slightly above the earth, where rest becomes possible even while frost rules the world beyond your door. You wake to a quieter morning. Snow has fallen again, soft and steady, muting the world outside. The shelter feels cocooned, wrapped in another layer of white silence. You sit up on the raised platform and listen to the faint hush beyond the entrance tunnel. Winter is no longer approaching. It has settled in. Your thoughts turn to what keeps you here beyond warmth. Shelter alone is not survival. Food, water, and careful storage are just as vital as fire and earth. You rise and move toward the section of wall where you plan to keep provisions away from the direct heat of the hearth, but still within reach. Archaeological excavations of semi-subterranean winter homes often reveal storage pits dug into the floor or along interior edges, sometimes lined with grass or bark. These pits helped protect dried foods from moisture and pests. You kneel and imagine carving a shallow recess into the packed soil, careful not to weaken the wall. The air inside remains dry and steady, ideal for preserving certain foods. Dried meat carefully prepared during warmer months would hang from wooden supports or rest in sealed containers. The faint scent of smoke from daily fires could even help deter insects. Researchers continued to examine how winter food preservation methods varied across regions. On the plains, dried bison meat combined with fat and berries created nutrient-dense mixtures that lasted through harsh seasons. In northern forested areas, fish and game were often dried or frozen naturally. Each region developed its own reliable strategies. You picture bundles of food suspended from crossbeams, safely out of reach of small animals. Even inside a sealed shelter, caution matters. Mice and other creatures seek warmth just as you do. Careful storage protects limited supplies. A well-documented practice among many indigenous communities involved storing excess food in underground caches outside the main dwelling, sometimes concealed and marked discreetly. These external caches served as backup reserves if interior supplies dwindled. You imagine stepping out on a clear day to check such a cache, brushing snow aside to reveal a hidden lid. You move toward the entrance tunnel and consider water. Snow can be melted for drinking, but it requires fuel. Efficient use of firewood becomes even more important when water must be heated daily. You kneel beside the hearth and place a small container near the embers, imagining snow slowly transforming into liquid. Scholars still explore how winter water access influenced settlement patterns. Communities near rivers might cut through ice carefully to draw fresh water, while others relied more heavily on stored ice or so. Proximity to reliable sources shaped long-term choices about winter habitation. You return to the storage area and inspect the imagined supplies again. Dried roots, nuts gathered in autumn, strips of meat cured carefully over weeks. Each item represents preparation long before the first frost. An intriguing historical detail notes that some winter houses featured suspended storage racks near the roof, taking advantage of warmer rising air to keep certain foods dry. The interior architecture served multiple functions at once. You sit cross-legged on the platform and think about patience. Food must be rationed thoughtfully. Storms may trap you inside for days at a time. Overconfidence early in the season can lead to scarcity later. Archaeological findings often show evidence of grinding stones and small food preparation areas within winter houses, indicating that daily meals were prepared inside during prolonged cold spells. You imagine the quiet sound of grinding dried corn or seeds that is steady and rhythmic against the hush of snow outside. Researchers continue to analyze residue found in ancient cooking vessels, revealing diets rich in preserved meats, of plant materials, and occasional fresh game when hunting was possible. Winter eating was not luxurious, but it was sustaining. You lean toward the hearth and stir the melting snow gently. Steam rises softly, disappearing into the smoke opening above. The smell is faint and clean. A lesser-known observation from historical narratives suggests that careful placement of food within the shelter also considered heat gradients. Items that could spoil more easily were kept farther from the hearth, while those that tolerated warmth remained closer. Even within a small space, temperature zones existed. You stand and walk slowly around the interior, visualizing how daily routines would revolve around these supplies. Morning fire tending, water melting, measured portions of dried food prepared carefully. The entrance tunnel remains quiet, a small guardian against drifting snow. You imagine opening it briefly to shake off accumulated frost, then sealing it again. Scholars continue to discuss how winter scarcity influenced social cooperation. In many communities, sharing food during difficult periods strengthened bonds and ensured collective survival. Individual hoarding rarely led to long-term success. You sit back down and feel the gentle warmth spreading once more through the chamber. Fire, shelter, and food form a triangle of survival. Remove one and the balance falters. An interesting anecdote from early observers recounts how, Winter meals inside earth lodges often felt communal and intimate, with family members seated close together around the hearth. The physical closeness mirrored emotional connection. You glance at the roof above, now buried under layers of snow and soil. The outside world feels distant. Inside, the space remains organized and purposeful. Archaeologists studying storage pits often note how carefully they were sealed, sometimes with flat stones or tightly packed soil lids to deter pests. Attention to detail prevented slow loss over weeks. You finish melting the snow and sip the warm water slowly. It tastes faintly of smoke, comforting rather than unpleasant. Winter demands restraint. Each stick of firewood, each handful of dried food carries weight. The shelter protects you, but thoughtful storage sustains you. You settle once more onto the platform, pulling a hide loosely across your lap. The air inside remains calm and steady, and as you listen to the quiet of snow resting on earth above, you understand that survival here is not dramatic. It is methodical. It is measured portions and careful placement. It is preparation meeting patience inside a chamber shaped by earth and fire. You notice as days pass and snow deepens that the shelter no longer feels like a project. It feels inhabited. The air carries the faint scent of smoke and dried grass. The walls have warmed subtly from steady fires. And now you begin to sense something equally important to warmth and food: shared labour. You imagine this space not as a solitary refuge, but as a place built by many hands. The digging, the hauling of poles, the weaving of brush, the packing of earth. None of it truly belongs to one person. Winter houses often rose from coordinated effort, with knowledge distributed across generations. Ethnographic accounts from several Plains and Mar communities describe collective lodge building in late autumn, where families worked together to prepare for the coming cold. The process itself strengthened social bonds. Tasks were divided naturally. Some shaped poles, others carried sod. Children gathered grasses and smaller materials. You sit near the hearth and picture the quiet rhythm of many people moving in and out of the pit before it was sealed. Laughter rising briefly above the scrape of tools. Advice offered softly from an elder who had seen many winters. Experience guided efficiency. Researchers continue to examine how construction roles were shared. While certain responsibilities often aligned with gender traditions within specific cultures, flexibility prevailed when necessity demanded it. Survival rarely tolerated rigid boundaries. You adjust a small bundle of brush near the wall, pressing it more firmly into place. Even now, maintenance continues. A shelter is never finished. It is tended. An intriguing detail preserved in some oral histories mentions that songs were sometimes sung during communal building efforts. The rhythm of music steadied movement and lightened physical strain. You imagine the quiet hum of a melody blending with the sound of soil being packed. You lean back against the curved wall and let your thoughts drift toward the broader winter community. Outside, other shelters may stand nearby, their rounded forms barely visible beneath snow. Smoke threads rising gently from multiple roof openings. The village becomes a constellation of warmth beneath a frozen sky. Archaeological surveys of clustered lodge sites reveal circular arrangements suggesting organized community layouts rather than random placement. Such patterns indicate planning not only for individual survival, but for collective living. Scholars still discuss how winter villages balance privacy with cooperation. Families occupied separate lodges, yet proximity allowed rapid assistance during storms or shortages. Shared labour in building often translated into shared responsibility during hardship. You stir the fire gently and imagine neighbours stepping through the entrance tunnel, brushing snow from their shoulders. Inside, conversation would unfold in low tones, voices softened by the earth walls. A lesser-known anecdote describes how winter storytelling traditions flourished within these semi-subterranean homes. The long nights provided time for narratives passed through generations. Stories preserved memory as effectively as stored food preserved nourishment. You picture elders seated near the warmest area by the hearth, children gathered close listening. The shelter becomes more than insulation. It becomes a vessel for culture. Anthropological studies often emphasize that winter months served as periods of teaching and craft production. With travel limited by snow time, shifted toward weaving, carving, repairing tools and preparing for spring hunts. The design of the shelter supported these activities by maintaining steady warmth. You glance toward the storage area and think of how shared food preparation would occur. Grinding seeds, slicing dried meat, stirring pots of melted snow. Movements overlap without crowding because the space has been shaped thoughtfully. Researchers continue to explore how social hierarchies manifested within lodge interiors. Seating arrangements, sleeping positions, and proximities to the hearth sometimes reflected status or age. Yet cooperation remained essential for group survival. You rise and walk slowly around the interior, tracing the curve of the wall with your fingertips. You imagine each surface once pressed and smoothed by different hands. The shelter holds the memory of labour within its walls. An interesting historical note suggests that during particularly harsh winters, neighbouring families sometimes consolidated into fewer lodges to conserve fuel and share resources more efficiently. The flexible design allowed for adaptation as conditions demanded. You sit again near the hearth and listen to the soft crackle of wood. The fire's glow feels communal even in solitude. Its warmth radiates evenly across the chamber. Scholars continue to analyse how cooperation during winter influenced political and social cohesion in indigenous communities. Shared hardship often deepened mutual trust and reinforced alliances. You imagine stepping outside after a snowfall and seeing footprints weaving between lodges, paths packed firm by repeated travel. These paths become arteries of connection, linking one warm chamber to another. A curious tidbit from early accounts mentions that visitors sometimes remarked on the sense of welcome inside winter lodges despite the austere landscape outside. Hospitality endured even in scarcity. You adjust the hide around your shoulders and reflect on how much of this shelter's strength lies not only in earth and timber but in collective effort. The roof stands because many lifted poles. The walls hold because many packed soil. Anthropological evidence often shows that winter communities developed intricate systems of mutual aid sharing, food and labour to ensure that no single household faced disaster alone. You glance toward the entrance tunnel again. Snow may block it temporarily during a storm, but help would not be far if others dwell nearby. The fire glows steadily, the air remains calm, the shelter feels alive with imagined voices and quiet companionship. And as you sit in the warmth of this carefully built space, you understand that underground shelters were not only engineering responses to cold, they were expressions of cooperation. Earth, timber and human hands working together to transform winter from an enemy into a season endured collectively. You step outside on a clear morning and look across the snow-covered land. The world feels vast and bright, the sky pale and endless above the white ground. Beneath your feet, however, your shelter rests quietly, half hidden a rounded rise that blends into the slope. You realise that what you have built is only one variation among many. Across the continent, different landscapes have inspired different solutions to the same winter problem. You walk slowly, imagining how geography shapes architecture. On the Great Plain, where trees gather mostly along rivers, communities such as the Mandan and Hidatsa constructed substantial earth lodges with heavy timber frames and thick sod roofs. In forested regions farther east, other groups developed semi-subterranean winter houses, using abundant wood for walls and supports. Far to the north, in harsher climates, dwellings were sometimes dug deeper and reinforced against extreme cold. Archaeological resources across North America reveal a remarkable diversity of earth-sheltered structures, each adapted to local conditions. Circular earth lodges on the plains, rectangular pit houses in parts of the southwest, and deeply recessed winter houses in subarctic regions all share the principle of using earth as insulation, yet differ in detail and proportion. You pause and imagine yourself standing in a plains village during winter. Large earth lodges cluster together, each with a central smoke opening and sloped exterior. Smoke rises in thin lines against the cold sky. Inside, thick timber beams radiate from a central support, creating a spacious interior capable of housing extended families. Researchers continue to explore how trade networks influenced architectural ideas, while some structural principles may have spread through contact between neighbouring groups. Much of the variation reflects independent adaptation to local climate, soil, and available materials. You kneel and scoop up a handful of snow, watching it melt slowly against your glove. In regions where snowfall is deep and persistent, shelters must withstand significant weight. Roof pitch and beam thickness adjust accordingly. In areas with lighter snow but intense wind entrance orientation and wall reinforcement take precedence. One interesting historical observation notes that in parts of the Columbia Plateau, pit houses were often partially underground with wooden superstructures covered in earth, forming low domes, similar in concept to plains lodges, but distinct in construction details. The underlying logic remained consistent. Earth moderates temperature. You imagine the subarctic, where winters stretch long and darkness dominates much of the day. Their winter houses sometimes featured extended entry tunnels and additional insulation layers to combat extreme cold. Smoke management required even greater precision in tightly sealed spaces. Scholars still examine whether certain architectural similarities across distant regions represent shared ancestry or parallel innovation. The debate continues, yet what stands out is how consistently communities recognize the insulating power of earth. You turn back toward your own shelter and notice how modest it appears against the open field. It does not tower. It does not compete with the horizon. It nestles. Ethnographic descriptions of Plains Earth lodges often emphasize their impressive size, some reaching diameters large enough to accommodate numerous occupants. The interior might include multiple sleeping platforms, storage areas, and a central hearth beneath a carefully framed smoke opening. Farther south, in parts of the southwest, pit houses sometimes evolved into more complex structures as climates shifted and populations grew. Archaeological evidence shows gradual architectural changes over centuries, reflecting both environmental and social developments. You imagine how seasonal patterns influence these forms. In some regions, semi-subterranean dwellings were occupied primarily during winter, while lighter structures served in warmer months. Mobility and permanence balanced according to subsistence strategies. Researchers continue to analyze soil composition at ancient lodge sites, identifying variations in construction techniques. Some roofs incorporated thicker sod layers. Others relied more heavily on woven reed mats beneath packed earth. Regional innovation flourished. A lesser-known detail recorded by early observers mentions that certain winter houses were built into natural banks or hillsides, reducing the amount of excavation required and increasing insulation on one side. The landscape itself became part of the architecture. You walk around the mound of your shelter and imagine how from a distance it might be mistaken for a natural rise. This blending offered subtle protection from both wind and potential threats. Scholars also discuss how climate fluctuations over centuries influence settlement patterns. Periods of colder weather may have encouraged deeper excavation and thicker coverings. Warmer intervals might have reduced reliance on fully subterranean designs. You step inside again and let your eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The curved walls remind you that this form, though simple, belongs to a wide family of designs across diverse territories. Archaeological findings often reveal charred roof beams preserved beneath collapsed earth, providing insight into structural methods. The arrangement of posts, the thickness of soil layers, and the size of smoke openings tell stories of adaptation. You sit near the hearth and imagine distant communities facing similar winter challenges, each responding with their own version of earth-embrace shelter. The principle remains steady. Use what surrounds you. Shape it thoughtfully. Allow the land to share its stability. One intriguing observation suggests that despite regional differences, many of these winter houses fostered similar interior atmospheres. Dim light, warm air, and quiet acoustics created spaces ideal for storytelling and craftwork during long nights. You lean back and feel the shelter around you, recognizing it as part of a larger pattern. Across plains, forests, mountains, and river valleys, people have lowered themselves into the earth to survive cold seasons. Researchers continued to compare these structures through excavations and reconstructions, seeking to understand how knowledge traveled and evolved. The diversity does not contradict unity. It demonstrates resilience. You glance upward at the smoke opening where pale daylight filters through. Your shelter stands as one expression of a widespread idea, and as you listen to the faint wind outside, you realize that winter architecture is not uniform. It is regional, responsive, and alive with variation. Yet beneath those differences lies a shared understanding that Earth itself can be shaped into refuge. You let your eyes adjust to the dim interior and imagine that the space around you grows wider, taller, more expansive. The modest shelter you built in your mind now stretches into the scale of a full Plains Earth lodge. Timber beams radiate from a central ring high above, forming a broad dome supported by thick posts set firmly into the ground. The air is warm, gently smoky, and alive with quiet movement. A firmly established historical record shows that communities such as the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara built large earth lodges along the Missouri River, some measuring 40 to 60 feet in diameter. These were not temporary huts, but substantial homes that could house extended families through harsh winters. Their size allowed for shared warmth and communal life beneath one roof. You stand near the entrance tunnel, which slopes upward into the Mendasi chamber. As you rise into the lodge, the ceiling opens above you in a graceful curve. The central smoke hole frames a patch of skylight filtering downward in a pale column that touches the hearth below. The hearth itself sits at the center, a circular basin ringed with stones. Above it, the smoke hole remains carefully balanced to allow steady ventilation. You watch a thin stream of smoke rise, hesitating briefly before slipping into the cold air beyond. Researchers continue to examine how these lodges balance structural strength with interior openness. Massive wooden posts supported the weight of thick earth roofs, yet the arrangement preserved a spacious central area for daily activities. You move toward the perimeter and see raised sleeping platforms lining the walls, each layered with mats and hides. Personal belongings rest neatly along the edges. Storage pits are sealed carefully near the walls away from direct heat. The walls themselves are layered with timber brush and thick sod. Snow outside rests quietly atop the roof, adding insulation. From within, you barely sense the storm beyond. An intriguing detail recorded by early visitors to Plains villages describes how these earth lodges felt surprisingly comfortable inside, even when snow lay deep outside. Some observers remarked on the warmth and dryness of the interior compared to their own wooden structures. You imagine the rhythm of winter life unfolding here. Children sit near the hearth listening to stories. Elders speak in calm voices. Hands weave baskets, mend clothing and prepare food. The space feels alive yet peaceful. Archaeological excavations of Plains Lodge sites often reveal deep post holes arranged in a circular pattern, evidence of the heavy central supports that once held the roof. Charred beam remnants tell of fires that burned steadily for months. Scholars still discuss how architectural design reflected social organization. The size of a lodge often indicated the presence of an extended family unit rather than a single household. Multiple generations shared the warmth and responsibilities of winter living. You glance upwards at the intersecting beams overhead. Their arrangement resembles the spokes of a wheel converging toward the smoke opening. The geometry is practical but also visually striking. A lesser-known anecdote recounts how some lodge builders selected particularly straight and strong timbers for central support, sometimes travelling significant distances to find suitable trees. Structural integrity depended on careful material choice. You kneel beside the hearth and feel the steady warmth radiating outward. Heat rises toward the dome before descending along the curved walls, circulating gently across sleeping platforms. Researchers continue to study how smoke staining on interior beams provides clues about ventilation efficiency. Patterns of soot reveal how well smoke escaped and how often fires were maintained. You walk slowly around the interior, tracing the circular wall with your fingertips. The curvature creates a sense of enclosure without confinement. Sound travels softly, voices blending without echoing sharply. Outside, the wind sweeps across the snow-covered plains. Inside, you hear only the faint crackle of burning wood and the quiet murmur of the imagined conversation. Ethnographic accounts describe how earth lodges often served as centers of community life during winter, hosting gatherings, ceremonies, and decision-making. Their stability and size made them ideal for sustained occupation. You sit on one of the raised platforms and imagine leaning against the wall wrapped in layered hides. The interior air feels steady, neither stifling nor drafty. Scholars continue to explore how seasonal cycles influence the maintenance of these lodges. Roof coverings required periodic repair and smoke holes were adjusted according to wind patterns. You look out toward the entrance tunnel again and see how it slopes gently downward before rising into the chamber. That dip traps cold air, effectively preventing sudden gusts from disturbing the hearth. An interesting historical observation notes that during especially severe winters, families might gather in fewer lodges to conserve fuel and share resources. These spacious interiors allowed flexibility. You rise and stand at the center beneath the smoke opening. Pale daylight touches your face. Above, the sky appears distant yet connected through that small circle. Archaeological research confirms that many Plains Earth lodges were rebuilt on the same sites over successive years, leaving layered soil patterns that reveal long-term occupation. You breathe deeply and sense how this larger lodge represents a refined expression of the principles you practiced in your smaller shelter. Earth insulation, central hearth, raised platforms, and controlled ventilation combine seamlessly. The lodge does not dominate the landscape. It sits low against the horizon, its rounded roof blending with the prairie. Yet inside it contains warmth, life, and continuity. And as you imagine winter stretching long across the plains outside, you understand how such structures transformed a harsh season into a period of stability. Beneath layers of timber and earth, families endured not by resisting winter's force, but by shaping the land into shelter and gathering close around a steady flame. You let the image of the Wide Plains Lodge soften, and in its place you picture a harsher horizon. The trees grow thinner here, darker, more tightly packed. The sky hangs lower and winter feels longer, almost endless. Snow does not merely dust the ground. It settles deep and remains for months. In this subarctic landscape, shelter must work harder. You stand at the edge of a forest clearing and look down at a winter house dug deeper than the one you first imagined. The excavation reaches well below the frost line, sometimes several feet into the earth. Only the roof and a narrow entrance tunnel rise above the snow surface. From a distance, it might look like a gentle mound with a faint plume of smoke curling upward. Archaeological investigations in northern regions of North America have uncovered semi-subterranean winter dwellings used by various indigenous communities, including Athabascan-speaking groups. These homes often feature deeper pits and more pronounced entry passages to combat extreme cold. Depth provided insulation where surface temperatures could plunge far below freezing. You crouch and run your hand along the packed snow above the roof. Beneath it lies timber brush and thick layers of earth. The structure must withstand heavy accumulation. Snow, though cold, becomes part of the insulation system once settled. Researchers continue to analyse how subarctic winter houses balance ventilation with the need to retain heat in climates where outside air could be dangerously cold. Smoke holes were often smaller and carefully managed. Entry tunnels extended outward and sometimes downward before rising into the main chamber, creating effective cold traps. You bend low and move through such a tunnel. It is narrow and deliberately elongated. The air inside the passage feels frigid at first, but as you reach the inner chamber and rise, warmth greets you gently. The interior is more compact than the large plains lodge. Space is precious here. Sleeping platforms line the walls raised well above the floor. The hearth sits centrally, but fuel must be conserved even more carefully in this environment. Ethnographic descriptions from northern communities note that winter houses were often occupied for extended periods, sometimes the majority of the cold season. Mobility decreased significantly when snow grew deep and daylight hours shortened dramatically. You sit near the hearth and imagine how firewood supply becomes critical. Gathering fuel in advance of heavy snowfall was essential. Once storms set in, travel through deep snow required effort and planning. Scholars still examine how these northern groups coordinated seasonal movements to ensure access to both shelter sites and sufficient wood resources. Winter houses were rarely placed randomly. Proximities to timber and water sources influenced their location. You glance toward the roof beams overhead. They appear closer than in the plains lodge, creating a cozier atmosphere. The smaller interior volume allows heat to concentrate more effectively. An intriguing historical note suggests that in some subarctic winter dwellings, walls were lined with additional insulating materials such as moss, which helped seal small gaps and reduce drafts. Moss abundant in northern forests proved surprisingly effective as insulation. You press your palm against the wall and feel its firmness. The deeper excavation means the surrounding soil remains relatively stable in temperature compared to the air above. Archaeologists studying these sites often find remnants of thick wooden frameworks beneath layers of collapsed earth, indicating substantial investment in structural stability. Roof beams needed to support not only soil, but also heavy snow accumulation. Researchers continue to discuss how interior lighting adapted to prolonged darkness in northern winters. Oil lamps fueled by animal fat sometimes supplemented hearthlight, providing steady illumination during long evenings. You imagine such a lamp glowing softly near a sleeping platform, its flame small but steady. Shadows move gently across the walls. The entrance tunnel remains crucial. Cold air sinks into its lowest section, pooling there rather than flooding the living space. This design minimizes sudden temperature shifts. Some scholars propose that extended entry passages also offered protection against sudden wildlife intrusion, as animals would hesitate to navigate a narrow-angled tunnel. Whether intentional or incidental, the feature added security. You adjust the imagined fire carefully. In such climates, even small miscalculations could lead to discomfort or danger. Overheating wastes fuel. Underheating invites frost to creep inward. A lesser-known anecdote from early northern observers recounts how visitors unfamiliar with these winter houses sometimes underestimated their effectiveness, only to be surprised by the relative comfort inside compared to the brutal exterior conditions. You settle back onto a raised platform and wrap a hide around your shoulders. The air feels dense with warmth despite the severe landscape outside. Archaeological evidence indicates that some subarctic winter houses were reused over multiple seasons, repaired and reinforced as needed. The continuity of occupation speaks to their reliability. Researchers continue to explore how knowledge of insulation materials and structural reinforcement passed between generations in these communities. Survival depended on precision. You close your eyes and listen to the imagined wind sweeping across the snow above. It howls across the forest canopy but barely disturbs the chamber below. In this northern setting, underground shelter becomes not just practical but essential. Exposure to open air for extended periods could be life-threatening. The earth offers a steady refuge against extremes. You feel the subtle warmth against your back and understand that design adjusts to environment. The principle remains constant, but the execution shifts according to climate. And as you sit within this deeper, tighter winter house, you sense the resilience embedded in its walls. Here, beneath layers of timber and frozen earth, communities endured seasons that tested endurance to its limit, sustained by careful construction and steady flame. You leave the deep forest in your imagination and follow the sound of moving water. Even in winter, a river can shift and murmur beneath its skin of ice. The air feels different here, slightly heavier, touched by moisture. You picture a shelter built not far from this water where fishing and travel routes shape daily life, even when snow settles thick on the banks. You stand on a gentle rise above the frozen river and look at a semi-subterranean home tucked into the slope. The earth has been carved carefully into the bank itself, reducing the need for extensive excavation. One wall is almost entirely natural hillside. The roof rises outward from that bank, supported by timber and covered in brush and soil. Archaeological surveys along major river systems in North America reveal numerous examples of dwellings built into natural embankments. Using a slope as part of the structure reduced labour and enhanced insulation on one side. It also provided drainage advantages during seasonal thaws. You kneel and press your hand into the packed earth of the bank. It feels firm and cool. Building here requires awareness of moisture patterns. Proximity to water offers resources, but introduces risk. Spring floods or ice breakup could threaten poorly chosen sites. Researchers continue to investigate how indigenous communities balanced access to rivers with long-term safety. Winter dwellings were often placed high enough above typical flood levels, reflecting generations of careful observation rather than guesswork. You move toward the entrance, which faces slightly away from the prevailing wind, yet remains accessible from the river path. The tunnel slopes gently upward into the main chamber, similar to others you have imagined, but the sound of distant water hums faintly beneath the quiet. Inside the chamber feels compact and efficient. Raised sleeping platforms line the interior walls. The hearth glows softly at the centre. The roof beams rest partly against the hillside, partly on vertical supports. An interesting historical observation notes that riverine communities often adapted their winter shelters to accommodate stored fishing equipment and nets which required dry conditions even during the coldest months. Storage areas were carefully positioned to prevent dampness. You sit near the hearth and imagine drying fish prepared in autumn, hung carefully away from smoke but protected from moisture. The faint scent of the river and wood smoke blends in the air. Scholars still examine whether proximity to water influenced interior humidity levels and how builders compensated for potential condensation. Ventilation adjustments likely varied with local conditions, ensuring the interior remained dry despite nearby ice and snow. You listen for the subtle creak of ice shifting on the river. It is distant but present. Life continues beneath frozen surfaces. A lesser-known anecdote from early accounts mentions that some winter dwellings near water included small exterior work areas shielded from wind where fish could be cleaned, or nets repaired on milder days. Even in winter tasks extended beyond the shelter walls. You step back outside and look across the frozen river. Snow blankets the banks, but the memory of flowing water persists. In warmer seasons, this same site would feel entirely different, alive with movement and travel. Archaeological findings along coastal regions reveal variations of semi-subterranean homes adapted to maritime climates. In some areas, driftwood provided essential roof supports where large trees were scarce. Resourcefulness shaped construction choices. Researchers continue to explore how coastal winds influenced entrance orientation and roof reinforcement. Salty air and moisture demanded durable materials and careful sealing. You return inside and feel the steady warmth once more. The hillside behind you acts as a natural barrier against wind. The earth on that side remains undisturbed and solid. Some historians propose that winter villages near rivers served as seasonal hubs for trade and communication, even during cold months when travel slowed but did not cease entirely. The shelter becomes not only a refuge but a point of connection. You sit on the raised platform and imagine footsteps along a packed snow path leading from neighbouring dwellings. The river corridor acts as a natural route between communities. An intriguing detail recorded in certain regional traditions suggests that building into a bank also offered acoustic benefits, further dampening exterior noise and creating a sense of enclosure that felt particularly comforting during storms. You lean against the wall and feel its cool firmness. The design here reflects compromise. Close enough to water for resource access, high enough to avoid seasonal danger reinforced carefully against moisture. Researchers continue to analyze soil samples from riverbank dwellings to determine how often repairs were necessary after heavy snowmelt. Maintenance likely formed part of the seasonal rhythm. The hearth glows gently. The air inside feels stable despite the faint hum of distant ice. You imagine stepping outside briefly to collect snow for melting, then returning quickly to warmth. The entrance tunnel shields the interior from sudden gusts off the river. Archaeological evidence from coastal and riverine sites often shows evidence of repeated occupation, suggesting that these carefully chosen locations proved reliable across generations. You settle once more near the hearth and listen to the quiet chamber around you. Earth on one side, timber above, river beyond. And as you picture winter life unfolding along frozen waterways, you recognize that underground shelters were never one-size-fits-all. They shifted with terrain and resource patterns responding to each landscape's demands. Whether on open plains, deep forests, or riverbanks humming beneath ice, the principle endured. Lower yourself into the earth, seal it, carefully tend the fire, and let the land steady you against the cold. You wake to the faintest trace of moisture on your fingertips. Not dripping, not alarming. Just a cool softness in the air that reminds you winter shelter is never entirely effortless. Outside snow may look dry and clean, but inside a warm chamber beneath earth, dampness can creep in quietly if left unchecked. You sit up on the raised platform and study the interior carefully. The fire has burned low overnight, leaving a gentle warmth that lingers in the soil walls. That stored heat meets the cold pressing from above, and somewhere between the two condensation can form. A widely recognised observation among archaeologists and architectural historians is that managing moisture was as critical as managing temperature in semi-subterranean homes. Too much dampness weakened insulation, encouraged mould growth and reduced comfort. Builders understood that warmth alone did not guarantee well-being. You run your hand along the wall and inspect it in the dim morning light. The surface feels firm, slightly cool, but not slick. That is a good sign. You glance upward toward the smoke opening, noting how the draft continues even with the fire low. Gentle airflow prevents stale air from accumulating. Researchers continue to examine how ventilation systems in earth lodges balanced heat retention with moisture control. Even a small consistent upward draft carried excess humidity away. Adjustable coverings over smoke holes allowed occupants to fine-tune this balance. You rise and move toward the entrance tunnel. A thin line of frost clings to its lower edge where cold air pools. That frost marks the boundary between outside chill and interior warmth. You brush it lightly with your glove, mindful not to widen the opening unnecessarily. An intriguing historical detail suggests that some communities occasionally scraped thin layers from interior walls if moisture accumulated, smoothing and resealing surfaces with fresh-packed earth. Maintenance was ongoing rather than reactive. You kneel by the hearth and add a few small sticks, coaxing a modest flame back to life. The warmth strengthens the upward movement of air through the smoke opening. Steam from a small pot of melted snow rises and disappears quickly. Scholars still discuss how seasonal changes influenced interior dampness. During deep winter, cold outside air held little moisture, reducing condensation risk. During late winter thaws, however, rising temperatures and melting snow could increase humidity inside shelters. You move to the sleeping platform and lift a corner of the hide bedding, checking for damp spots. The materials feel dry and resilient. Elevation above the floor has preserved their insulation quality. Ethnographic descriptions often mention that bedding was shaken and aired during clear days, even in cold weather, to maintain dryness. Brief exposure to sunlight refreshed materials before they returned to the warmth of the lodge. You step outside briefly and notice the sun shining brightly over the snow. The air is crisp, dry, and brilliant. You carry a rolled hide into the open light and let it rest for a short while. The act feels simple but preventive. Researchers continue to analyze soil samples from excavated winter dwellings, searching for evidence of mold spores or moisture patterns. Findings suggest that careful ventilation and regular maintenance limited long-term damage in well-constructed shelters. You return inside and close the entrance carefully. The interior air feels balanced once more. Fire crackles gently, releasing steady warmth. A lesser-known anecdote from early observers recounts how visitors sometimes remarked on the surprisingly fresh smell inside earth lodges, attributing it to the combination of dry soil, wood smoke, and constant airflow. The stereotype of mustiness did not always match reality. You sit near the hearth and consider how subtle this battle against dampness truly is. There are no dramatic floods, no dripping to ceilings, just quiet vigilance. Scholars continue to debate whether certain regions experienced more significant moisture challenges than others due to soil type or climate. Sandy soils drained well, but offered less structural strength. Clay soils held shape but required attention to prevent cracking and moisture retention. You press your palm once more against the curved wall and feel its steady coolness. The soil absorbs and releases warmth gradually, but it does not trap excess humidity if airflow remains consistent. Outside, you imagine snow melting slightly under midday sun before refreezing at night. That freeze-thaw cycle demands attention to roof integrity. Packed earth must remain firm so water does not seep downward. Archaeological evidence sometimes reveals additional layers of organic material between roof beams and soil, acting as barriers against moisture penetration. These intermediate layers reduce the risk of interior leaks during thaw periods. You adjust the smoke opening, slightly narrowing it as the fire strengthens. The draft remains steady but controlled. An interesting historical note mentions that in some winter dwellings, small stones were placed along the interior wall base to assist with drainage of minor seepage. Practical adjustments like this reflect careful observation over time. You stretch your legs toward the hearth and feel the steady warmth along your boots. The air remains clear, free from heavy smoke or damp chill. Researchers continue to explore how knowledge of moisture management passed across generations, likely through demonstration rather than formal instruction. Children growing up inside such shelters learn to notice subtle changes in air and surface texture. You inhale deeply and sense the clean blend of smoke and earth. No stale heaviness lingers. And as you sit quietly listening to the faint crackle of flame and the muted hush of snow above, you realize that surviving winter underground is not only about creating warmth, it is about maintaining balance. Heat and airflow, insulation and dryness, attention to small details that keep comfort steady over weeks and months. The shelter does not demand constant struggle. It asks for watchfulness. And in that steady watchfulness you find the quiet art of keeping winter's damp edge at bay. You notice how dim the shelter feels as another long evening settles in. The smoke opening above frames only a small circle of fading grey. Snow clouds drift across that patch of sky, and daylight retreats early. Winter light is brief and hesitant. Inside this earthen chamber, illumination must be created deliberately. You sit near the hearth and watch the low flames flicker. Fire provides warmth first, light second. A strong blaze brightens the interior but consumes precious fuel. A modest flame preserves wood but leaves shadows deep along the walls. You must balance brightness with conservation. A well-documented aspect of winter life in semi-subterranean dwellings is the use of supplementary lighting beyond the hearth. In many regions, small lamps fueled by animal fat offered steady contained light that required less wood. These lamps, often carved from stone or shaped from clay, held a wick of plant fibre or moss. You imagine placing such a lamp on a flat stone near your sleeping platform. You trim the wick carefully and ignite it. The flame is small but constant, casting a warm glow across the curved wall. Researchers continue to analyse residue found in ancient lamp fragments, confirming the use of rendered animal fats as fuel. These lamps provided reliable light during long evenings when tending a larger fire would be impractical. You glance toward the entrance tunnel. It remains dark, but the interior now feels softly illuminated. Light reflects gently off the packed soil, which takes on a golden hue under flame. An intriguing detail recorded in some ethnographic accounts notes that interior surfaces were sometimes smoothed intentionally to improve light reflection. A well-packed even wall scatters light more effectively than a rough one. Subtle craftsmanship influences atmosphere. You shift slightly and notice how shadows move in response to the lamp's small flicker. The effect is calming rather than dramatic. The space feels intimate. Scholars still explore how communities organised evening activities around available light. Craftwork requiring precision often took place closer to the hearth or a lamp. Storytelling and conversation thrived in softer shadows. You imagine hands weaving fibres or repairing tools under this gentle glow. The rhythm of winter evenings unfolds slowly without urgency. Archaeological findings from certain winter dwellings include small stone bowls with burn marks consistent with lamp use. These artifacts offer quiet testimony to the need for reliable light in underground spaces. You adjust the wick slightly, ensuring the flame burns cleanly without excessive smoke. Ventilation through the smoke opening carries faint fumes upward. A lesser-known anecdote describes how children sometimes traced patterns on the earthen walls by lamplight, their fingers leaving temporary marks in soft soil. The chamber became both home and canvas during long nights. You sit back and allow your eyes to adapt fully. Even with minimal light, the interior feels navigable. You know the curve of each wall, the position of the hearth, the location of storage pits. Researchers continue to discuss how circadian rhythms adapted to prolonged darkness in northern latitudes. Extended winter nights likely encourage slower routines and deeper rest. You glance upward, at the smoke opening once more. Stars begin to appear beyond it, faint but steady. The opening frames the night sky like a distant lantern. An interesting historical observation notes that some winter dwellings incorporated reflective materials, such as light-coloured hides near the hearth to enhance illumination. Small adjustments amplified available light without increasing fuel consumption. You rise and walk slowly around the chamber, observing how light pools differently in each corner. The raised platforms catch more glow while the lower floor remains dimmer. The effect reinforces warmth near sleeping areas. Scholars continue to analyse soot patterns near smoke holes, suggesting how fire size and lamp use influenced interior brightness over time. You kneel beside the hearth and add a small stick, careful not to build a roaring blaze. The flame brightens briefly, casting stronger shadows, then settles again. The shelter feels like a small world unto itself, now separate from the vast frozen landscape above. Light defines its boundaries, carving comfort from darkness. You rest against the curved wall and let the lamplight flicker across your hands. Outside wind brushes gently over snow, but inside the air remains steady. Researchers continue to explore how winter storytelling traditions relied on this intimate lighting. Dim glow fosters focus, drawing listeners inward. You imagine voices rising softly in this space, carried by warmth and reflected by earth. The lamp's flame steadies its small circle of brightness, enough for comfort. You feel no need for more. And as night deepens beyond the smoke opening, you understand that underground shelter is not only about blocking cold, it is about shaping light, controlling brightness and shadow so that long winter evenings feel safe rather than oppressive. The earthen walls hold warmth. The small lamp holds illumination. Together they transform darkness into something gentle, something manageable, something that invites rest rather than fear. You wake before the fire fully fades, the shelter still wrapped in a soft amber glow. Your first instinct is not to reach for wood, but to pull your hide cloak more snugly around your shoulders. Shelter and fire do much of the work, yet they are only part of the system. What you wear inside this earthen chamber matters just as much as the walls around you. You sit up on the raised platform and run your fingers along the layered garments resting beside you. Winter clothing in many indigenous communities was not a single heavy piece, but a thoughtful arrangement of layers. Each layer trapped air, and trapped air held warmth. Ethnographic records from across North America consistently describe the use of well-tanned hides, fur-lined garments, and carefully stitched seams designed to reduce heat loss. On the plains, bison robes offered exceptional insulation. In northern forests, caribou hides were valued for their hollow hair, which provided remarkable warmth. You slip on a soft inner layer, first imagining finely prepared skin worn with the fur turned inward. Over that, you drape a heavier outer robe. The weight feels reassuring rather than burdensome. Researchers continue to examine how clothing technology evolved in response to climate extremes. The cut of a garment, the direction of fur, and the tightness of stitching all influenced heat retention. Winter survival relied on textile knowledge as much as architectural design. You stand and move toward the hearth, feeling how your layers respond to warmth. Near the fire, you loosen the outer robe slightly. Away from it, you draw it closer again. Clothing allows you to regulate comfort without constantly adjusting the flame. An intriguing detail preserved in historical accounts notes that some communities softened hides using brains and natural oils, creating supple material that retained warmth while remaining flexible. The preparation process required skill and patience. You kneel and stir the embers, gently adding a small stick. The fire brightens, but remains controlled. Overheating the shelter wastes fuel and can lead to excess dryness or discomfort. Clothing fills the gap between moderate fire and personal warmth. Scholars still explore how winter attire varied not only by region but by activity. Garments worn during travel or hunting differed from those used inside the lodge. Layers could be added or removed according to need. You move toward the entrance tunnel briefly and feel the colder air pooling there. Even within the shelter, microclimates exist. Near the doorway, you draw your robe tighter. Closer to the hearth, you ease it open. Archaeological evidence from preserved textiles and tools suggests that sewing techniques were highly developed. Bone needles and sinew thread allowed precise stitching, reducing drafts through seams. You return to the platform and sit cross-legged, imagining the quiet work of repairing clothing during long winter evenings. Small tears must be mended quickly before they grow. Maintenance of garments parallels maintenance of the shelter itself. A lesser-known anecdote recounts how some winter robes doubled as bedding at night, layered over sleeping platforms for additional insulation. Clothing and bedding blurred into one another in function. Researchers continue to analyze how fur direction influenced insulation efficiency. Wearing fur inwards trapped warmth against the body, while fur outwards sometimes provided protection from snow and moisture during travel. You stretch your legs toward the hearth and feel heat rise gently through your layers. The shelter's insulation reduces the need for extreme clothing indoors, but layered garments ensure comfort even if the fire burns low. Scholars also discuss how footwear played a critical role in winter survival. Moccasins lined with fur or stuffed with dry grasses insulated feet against cold ground, especially when stepping outside briefly. You You glance at your imagined footwear near the entrance and appreciate how even small details like dry grass inserts could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. Historical description often emphasized that winter clothing was not static fashion, but dynamic equipment adapted and adjusted throughout the season. You rise and move slowly around the interior, testing how your layers respond to motion. Heat builds slightly as you walk. You loosen your outer robe again. The interplay between shelter, fire, and clothing forms a delicate balance. Each component supports the others. A well-insulated lodge reduces the need for heavy indoor clothing. Effective garments reduce strain on fuel supplies. Researchers continued to examine how communities coordinated preparation of both shelters and clothing before winter fully arrived. Autumn months were filled with tanning hides, repairing garments and reinforcing structures. You sit once more near the hearth and let the warmth settle into your layers. The air remains calm and steady. An interesting historical note mentions that children often learned sewing skills early, practicing on smaller pieces before contributing to essential winter garments. Knowledge passed quietly from hand to hand. You lean back against the curved wall and feel the combined effect of earth, insulation, and layered clothing. Your body relaxes fully. Outside, wind may rise or snow may deepen, but inside, warmth remains manageable. And as you adjust your robe slightly and listen to the faint crackle of embers, you recognize that underground shelter does not work alone. It partners with clothing crafted from the land itself. Hide fur, sinew, and earth all cooperate to shield you from winter's bite. Comfort here is not accidental. It is layered, thoughtful, balanced. The shelter holds the air steady, the fire feeds warmth gently, and your garments complete the circle, wrapping your body in the final layer of quiet protection. You wake to the soft murmur of imagined voices around you. The shelter feels lived in now, not just constructed. The fire glows low at the center, casting gentle light onto the curved walls. You stretch slowly on the raised platform and consider how daily life unfolds inside this earthen refuge when winter holds the land in its quiet grip. Morning begins with small movements. Someone stirs embers, someone else brushes frost from the entrance tunnel. The air inside feels steady, touched by warmth that has soaked into the walls over weeks. You picture elders rising carefully from their platforms, children still curled beneath hides reluctant to leave sleep. Ethnographic descriptions from various indigenous communities note that winter days inside semi-subterranean dwellings often followed a calm rhythm. Tasks were practical and measured. Fire tending, water melting, preparing preserved food, mending clothing. The pace slowed naturally with shorter daylight hours. You sit near the hearth and imagine an elder guiding a child's hands as they learn to twist fibers into cordage. Knowledge passes quietly in winter spaces. The design of the shelter encourages closeness, which fosters teaching. Researchers continue to explore how extended winter residence influenced intergenerational learning. The contained environment of an earth lodge created ideal conditions for storytelling and skill transmission, with fewer distractions from travel or seasonal hunts. You rise and move toward the entrance tunnel, stooping as you pass through. A thin layer of snow rests outside, sparkling faintly in pale light. You clear the opening gently, ensuring fresh air can circulate without allowing cold to rush inward. Inside again, you notice how warmth gathers near the platforms. Children gravitate there instinctively, sitting close to the wall where heat lingers. Elders remain near the hearth's steady glow. A widely recognized pattern in historical accounts is that winter months often strengthened family bonds. With mobility reduced, households spent extended time together inside their shelters. Cooperation and patience became essential virtues. You kneel beside the storage pit and measure out a careful portion of dried meat. Rationing requires foresight. Winter may stretch longer than expected. Meals are modest but nourishing. Scholars still examine how food sharing operated within winter villages. In many communities, surplus was redistributed to ensure that no household faced starvation alone. Mutual aid formed a protective layer as important as earth and timber. You return to the hearth and place a small pot near the embers. Steam rises gently as snow melts into water. The air remains clear, ventilations steady. An intriguing detail from certain regional traditions mentions that winter was often considered the proper season for telling specific sacred stories as outdoor distractions lessened and communal focus deepened. The shelter became both home and classroom. You settle onto the platform and imagine the afternoon unfolding. Someone repairs a hunting tool. Another person weaves a basket. Children practice stitching small pieces of hide under patient supervision. Researchers continued to analyze how winter craft production contributed to long-term survival. Tools repaired and garments prepared during cold months supported spring hunts and travel. You glance upward at the smoke opening. Pale daylight filters through briefly before clouds drift across it. The rhythm of light and shadow shapes daily activity. A lesser-known anecdote recounts how some winter houses hosted quiet games or competitions among children to ease monotony during long storms. Laughter echoed softly against earthen walls. You stretch your legs toward the hearth and feel warmth settle into your layers. Outside wind rises faintly, brushing across snow packed above the roof. Scholars continue to discuss how leadership and decision-making occurred during winter gatherings within lodges. Important discussions about hunting territories, alliances, and seasonal plans often took place during these enclosed months. You imagine elders speaking thoughtfully near the fire, voices steady and measured. The shelter holds their words gently, preventing them from scattering into cold air. Archaeological evidence from winter village sites frequently reveals evidence of long-term occupation with layers of hearth ash and repaired post holes indicating repeated seasonal return. You stand briefly and walk around the interior, appreciating how each feature supports daily routine. Storage near walls, hearth at centre platforms raised for comfort. An interesting historical observation notes that winter houses were sometimes decorated subtly with personal items or symbolic objects, adding individuality to otherwise practical spaces. You sit once more and pull a hide around your shoulders. The chamber feels calm, balanced. Researchers continue to explore how children raised within such environments develop strong observational skills, learning to read subtle changes in fire airflow and weather through daily exposure. The fire crackles softly. The air remains steady. You realize that winter inside an underground shelter is not a dramatic struggle against elements every hour. It is a sequence of small tasks repeated patiently, tending embers, mending seams, sharing stories, listening. And as you lean back against the curved wall and let the warmth settle around you, you understand that survival here is woven into routine. Each quiet action strengthens the fabric of the season. Beneath earth and snow, life continues gently measured, not by grand events, but by the steady rhythm of care and connection. Night settles early again, and the shelter grows still except for the soft breathing of those around you and the faint crackle of embers at the hearth. The smoke opening frames a patch of dark sky where stars glimmer briefly between drifting clouds. Inside this earthen chamber, wintertime stretches differently. Hours feel longer, quieter, almost suspended. You shift slightly on the raised platform and listen as a voice begins to speak. It is low and steady, shaped by years of repetition. Winter nights have always been a season for Zagrees. Across many indigenous cultures in North America, oral traditions were especially emphasized during colder months. Certain narratives were told only in winter, when the land rested and spirits were believed to listen differently. This seasonal storytelling is well documented in ethnographic records and remains part of living traditions today. You imagine children leaning closer to the hearth, their faces lit softly by flame. Outside wind brushes across snow, but inside attention gathers around the speaker's words. The curved walls reflect sound, gently holding it within the chamber. Researchers continue to examine how architectural space influenced oral tradition. Semi-subterranean lodges with their enclosed acoustics and intimate lighting created ideal conditions for focused listening. Stories did not scatter into open air, they lingered. You rest your chin lightly on your hand and let the rhythm of storytelling wash over you. The tale might recount the origin of fire, the journey of an animal spirit, or the lessons of an ancestor who survived a harsh winter through patience and wisdom. An intriguing historical detail notes that in some communities storytelling was restricted to winter evenings, specifically because certain animals believed to be connected to the stories were hibernating and therefore would not overhear or be offended. Seasonal boundaries shaped narrative practice. The fire glows softly at the center, casting shadows that move like silent companions across the walls. You notice how the smoke rises steadily, barely visible in the dim light. Scholars still explore how storytelling reinforced practical survival knowledge. Embedded within myths and legends were lessons about weather patterns, animal behavior, and social cooperation. Winter stories were not merely entertainment, they were instruction. You glance toward the entrance tunnel, which remains sealed against the cold. The outside world feels distant, almost unreal. Inside, words carry warmth equal to the fire. Archaeological findings cannot preserve stories directly, but they reveal long-term winter occupation patterns that support ethnographic accounts of extended seasonal residence. Thick ash layers and repaired structural elements suggest many evenings spent in similar gatherings. You lean back against the earthen wall and feel its steady presence behind you. The shelter becomes a container not only for bodies but for memory. A lesser-known anecdote from early observers describes how some winter evenings included gentle games of wit or memory, where elders challenged youth to recall portions of stories accurately. Such practices ensured continuity across generations. Researchers continue to consider how the design of winter lodges may have influenced social hierarchy during storytelling. The speaker often sat near the hearth's central light while listeners arranged themselves along platforms, reinforcing subtle spatial organization. You close your eyes briefly and let the cadence of an imagined voice drift through you. The story's pace is unhurried. There is no rush in winter. Time unfolds slowly beneath snow. The fire dims slightly and someone reaches forward to adjust a small log. Flame brightens, then settles again. Ethnographic studies highlight how winter also served as a season for ceremonial practices within these shelters. Songs, dances in limited space, and ritual acts took place indoors when travel became difficult. You picture rhythmic hand drums sounding softly within the enclosed chamber, the curved walls amplifying their steady beat. The sound feels intimate rather than overwhelming. Scholars continue to examine how spiritual life adapted to seasonal constraints, with winter dwellings serving as focal points for communal identity. You glance upward once more at the smoke opening. Snow begins to fall again, flakes drifting past the small circle of sky before vanishing into darkness. Inside, warmth persists. The earthen walls hold both heat and echo. A curious historical observation mentions that some winter stories were intentionally long, stretching across several evenings, encouraging listeners of them to return nightly to hear the next part. The structure of the tale mirrored the structure of the season. You settle deeper into your bedding, the hide warm against your shoulders. The story continues, voice rising and falling gently. Researchers still reflect on how the interplay of architecture and narrative shaped cultural continuity. Without enclosed winter spaces, such sustained storytelling might have been more difficult in harsh climates. The embers glow low once more, casting a steady amber circle at the centre of the chamber. And as you listen to the quiet cadence of winter voices within this underground refuge, you realise that shelter does more than block wind. It gathers people close enough to share memory. Beneath soil and snow, stories find their most attentive audience, carried softly from one generation to the next while the cold waits patiently outside. You wake to the faint scent of smoke lingering gently in the air. The fire has burned low, but steady, its embers glowing like small watchful eyes at the centre of the chamber. Winter shelters offer warmth and protection, yet they also demand respect. Fire, while essential, can become dangerous if treated carelessly beneath layers of timber and earth. You sit upright on the raised platform and look toward the hearth. The depression that holds the embers is shallow, but defined, ringed with stones that contain the coals. That boundary matters. Sparks must remain where they belong. Archaeological investigations of Earth Lodge sites often reveal carefully constructed hearth basins, lined with stone or compacted clay. These features suggest deliberate attention to fire safety within enclosed spaces. Builders understood that a stray ember near dry bedding or brush could lead to disaster. You rise and kneel beside the hearth, stirring the embers gently to revive a small flame. You avoid stacking wood too high. A modest, controlled fire produces steady warmth without overwhelming smoke. Researchers continue to examine how ventilation systems evolved to prevent smoke accumulation and reduce the risk of carbon buildup inside semi-subterranean dwellings. The placement and adjustable size of smoke openings were crucial elements in maintaining safe air quality. You glance upward at the smoke hole, noting how the draft carries thin threads of smoke away. Even small changes in wind direction can alter airflow. Attention remains constant. A historical observation frequently noted in ethnographic accounts is that fire-tending responsibilities were often assigned carefully within households. Knowledge of how to maintain embers through the night, how to adjust fuel, and how to read smoke patterns was valued skill. You step toward the entrance tunnel and brush away a thin line of frost. Clear pathways prevent accidental stumbles while carrying wood or whatever inside. Scholars still consider how seasonal conditions influenced fire management. In extremely cold climates, fires might burn nearly continuously, increasing the importance of fuel conservation and ventilation precision. You return to the hearth and add a small log, placing it deliberately rather than tossing it in. Sparks leap briefly, then settle. You watch closely to ensure none escape beyond the stone ring. An intriguing detail preserved in certain regional accounts mentions that some winter dwellings kept a small container of water or snow nearby, specifically to extinguish stray embers quickly. Simple precaution prevented catastrophe. You glance toward the roof beams above, hidden beneath layers of brush and earth. Though protected, the wooden ribs still require vigilance. Excessive heat could weaken them over time. Archaeological evidence from some lodge sites includes signs of fire damage or structural collapse likely caused by uncontrolled flames. Such findings remind modern researchers that even well-designed shelters required careful management. You sit back on the platform and feel the steady warmth reach your boots. The air remains clear, a sign that smoke is venting properly. Researchers continue to explore how children learned fire safety practices within these enclosed spaces. Observing elders tend embers taught them both technique and caution. You adjust the hide near your shoulder, ensuring it rests far enough from the hearth. Bedding must never crowd the fire. A lesser-known anecdote from early observers describes how some winter houses used flat stones heated near the hearth and then moved to sleeping areas to provide warmth without open flame nearby. Such methods reduced fire risk during sleep. You imagine lifting a warmed stone carefully and placing it near the edge of your platform wrapped in cloth or hide. Gentle heat radiates outward without sparks. Scholars still discuss how smoke openings were sometimes partially covered during storms to prevent downdrafts, yet never sealed entirely while a fire burned. Balance between heat retention and airflow remained critical. You walk once more around the interior, checking seams where brush meets timber. Packed soil above should shield most materials, but awareness prevents small problems from growing. The entrance tunnel remains low and controlled, preventing sudden gusts from feeding the flame unexpectedly. Archaeological reconstructions often highlight the importance of central hearth placement in distributing heat evenly and minimizing risk to walls and bedding. You return to sit near the fire and watch its movement. Flames lean slightly as air shifts upward. The draft feels stable. Researchers continue to examine how winter dwellings were arranged to allow quick access to the exit if needed, even in deep snow conditions. You glance toward the tunnel, again ensuring it remains clear enough for safe passage. The fire crackles softly, neither roaring nor fading. Its glow steadies the chamber. And as you sit within this carefully constructed refuge, you understand that warmth must always be balanced with caution. The same flame that protects against frost can threaten the very shelter that contains it. Winter survival underground is not a collector's defiance of the cold. It is thoughtful stewardship of heat, tending embers with patience, respecting boundaries, allowing fire to serve without overwhelming. You lean back against the curved wall and watch the flame settle into a steady glow, once more secure in the knowledge that vigilance keeps comfort intact beneath the weight of snow above. You wake to a sound that feels different, not the gentle hush of ordinary snowfall, but a deeper pressure. Wind moves heavily across the roof above, pushing snow against the packed earth. The shelter holds steady, yet you sense the storm's strength in the faint vibration of the timber ribs. You sit up slowly and listen. The entrance tunnel carries a low murmur of wind, like distant water moving through a narrow channel. Inside, the air remains calm, warmed by embers that still glow faintly at the hearth. Blizzards were a recurring reality across many regions of North America, particularly on the plains and in northern forests. Historical weather records and oral traditions alike describe as storms that lasted for days, burying structures and reshaping landscapes. Semi-subterranean shelters proved especially resilient during such events, because their low profiles resisted wind more effectively than tall above-ground dwellings. You rise and move carefully toward the entrance tunnel. A thin drift of snow has begun to gather along its outer lip. You clear it gently with your hands, ensuring that airflow remains unobstructed. The tunnel's downward dip traps cold air effectively, but it must not become completely sealed. Researchers continue to examine how winter house designs incorporated emergency strategies for prolonged storms. Extended entry passages and reinforced roof beams reduced risk of collapse under heavy snow loads. You return inside and add a small piece of wood to the hearth. The flame brightens modestly enough to sustain warmth but not waste fuel. Storms may limit access to additional firewood. Conservation becomes essential. An intriguing historical detail suggests that during severe blizzards, families sometimes limited movement within the lodge to reduce drafts and preserve heat. Activity slowed deliberately, matching the storm's forced stillness. You sit on the raised platform and feel the subtle vibration of wind against the mound above. Snow piles quietly adding weight, but also insulation. Archaeological reconstructions demonstrate that earth-covered roofs distribute snow load evenly across curved beams. The dome shape reduces pressure points that might otherwise cause collapse. Scholars still consider how communities monitored structural integrity during extended storms. Subtle creaks or shifts in timber likely signaled when reinforcement or snow removal was necessary. You imagine stepping outside briefly between gusts to brush excess snow from the roof. If accumulation becomes extreme, the act must be swift and cautious. Inside, the shelter feels steady. The walls do not tremble. The hearth glows softly, radiating calm warmth. A lesser-known anecdote recounts how some winter dwellings were equipped with small secondary vents that could be opened if the primary smoke hole became obstructed by snow. Flexibility enhanced safety. You glance upwards at the smoke opening. For now, smoke escapes cleanly. If drifting snow begins to block it, you will need to clear it carefully. Researchers continue to analyze ash layers in excavated lodges, noting consistent fire use even during severe weather periods. Such evidence suggests that shelters remained habitable through extended storms. You pull your robe closer around your shoulders and sit near the hearth, conserving energy. Outside, wind howls more loudly now, brushing snow against the mound in steady waves. The entrance tunnel grows quieter as snow builds against its outer walls. Cold air remains pooled in the lower section, preventing sudden gusts from entering the main chamber. Ethnographic accounts from plains communities often describe families remaining inside their earth lodges for several days during intense blizzards, relying on stored food and fuel until skies cleared. You stir the embers gently and adjust a small log. The fire responds without flaring too high. Scholars still examine how psychological resilience factored into winter survival. Extended confinement required patience and calm. The shelter's design supported this by maintaining steady temperature and muffling exterior noise. You listen closely. Beneath the roar of wind above the interior remains surprisingly tranquil. The earth absorbs much of the storm's force. Archaeological evidence of collapsed structures occasionally reveals the rare failures of poorly maintained lodges. Such findings underscore the importance of thoughtful construction and regular upkeep. You glance toward the storage pit, reassured by the presence of preserved food. Storms may delay hunting or gathering, but preparation sustains you. Outside, snow continues to accumulate, but inside the chamber feels secure. An interesting historical observation notes that after particularly intense storms, communities often emerge to help one another clear entrances and assess damage collectively. Cooperation resumed immediately once wind subsided. You settle back against the wall and close your eyes briefly, letting the storm's distant rumble fade into background noise. The fire crackles softly, the air remains steady, and as wind lashes the snow above and drifts pile against the entrance, you recognize the strength of this underground refuge. Its low profile defies gusts. Its thick roof bears weight. Its tunnel traps cold air. Winter may roar and swirl, but beneath layers of timber and earth you sit in quiet warmth, patient and prepared, waiting for the storm to spend itself against a shelter built with foresight and care. When the storm finally loosens its grip, the world outside your entrance tunnel feels newly shaped. Snow lies in sculpted drifts, wind carved and gleaming under pale sunlight. You crouch at the tunnel mouth and peer out carefully. The air is sharp and clean, carrying that peculiar silence that follows heavy weather. You step outside, slowly, boots sinking into fresh powder. The mound of your shelter blends almost seamlessly with the landscape. Only the faint rise of the smoke opening and the tunnel entrance reveal human presence. It is a quiet kind of invisibility. In many regions of North America, winter wildlife activity changed but never disappeared. Historical and ecological records show that deer, foxes, wolves, and smaller animals continued to move across snowy terrain, leaving tracks that told detailed stories to those who knew how to read them. Snow became a canvas of information. You pause and examine a set of delicate prints not far from the entrance. Small, close together, perhaps a fox investigating the scent of smoke or stored food. You feel a flicker of caution, not fear. The shelter must protect not only against cold, but against curious creatures. Researchers continued to study how winter dwellings were positioned, with awareness of animal movement patterns. Proximity to hunting grounds was advantageous, but so was distance from known predators' trails. You circle the mound, slowly brushing excess snow from the smoke opening to ensure airflow remains clear. The roof has held well under the storm's weight. Timber ribs beneath thick soil have distributed pressure evenly. An intriguing historical observation notes that in some communities, scraps of bone or food waste were disposed of deliberately at a distance from winter lodges to discourage animals from approaching the entrance. Cleanliness around the dwelling served practical defense. You kneel and run your hand lightly over another track larger this time, perhaps a deer passing through in search of forage beneath the snow. Winter hunting often relied on tracking skill reading depth and direction with precision. Archaeological evidence from winter village sites frequently reveals concentrations of animal bones and processing areas slightly removed from main dwellings, suggesting deliberate spatial organization to manage waste and scent. Scholars still debate how much winter hunting occurred during the coldest months versus reliance on stored food. Oral traditions and material evidence suggest a balance. Opportunities were taken when safe but risk was weighed carefully. You glance toward the tree line and imagine a hunter stepping quietly through snowbow in hand, reading subtle depressions and disturbed powder. The shelter behind him offers warmth upon return. A lesser-known anecdote preserved in some regional accounts recounts how children were taught to recognize common winter tracks through games identifying species from patterns left in fresh snow. Education began early, even in play. You return to the entrance tunnel and stoop inside. The temperature shift feels immediate comforting. Inside, the air remains calm and warm. You brush snow from your boots near the threshold, preventing meltwater from dampening the floor. Researchers continued to examine how winter dwellings were protected against animal intrusion. The low-angled entrance discouraged larger predators while interior storage practices minimized scent. You sit near the hearth and imagine hanging strips of dried meat high from crossbeams beyond easy reach of smaller creatures. Vigilance persists even in calm weather. An interesting historical detail notes that some communities set subtle perimeter markers or windbreaks around winter lodges not as barriers but as gentle deterrents to wandering animals. You added a small stick to the fire and listened to its quiet crackle. The storm has passed, but winter remains. Archaeological findings often include small tools used for skinning and processing game within winter houses, evidence that successful hunts were brought back promptly to warmth. Scholars continue to explore how winter survival depended not only on shelter construction, but on keen environmental awareness. Reading tracks, understanding animal behavior, and managing waste all formed part of the system. You lean back against the curved wall and feel the steady heat through your layers. Outside, the fox may circle again, curious but cautious. The deer may return to paw at snow for hidden grasses. The shelter stands low and unassuming against the vast white landscape. And as you listen to the quiet after storm, you recognize that winter survival underground extends beyond insulation and fire. It includes awareness of the living world that shares the season with you. Snow reveals movement, tracks whisper stories. The mound of earth protects you, but your understanding of the land keeps that protection secure. Within thick walls and beneath a roof layered with soil and snow, you remain watchful yet calm, part of a winter landscape where human refuge and animal path intersect without conflict. The storm has passed, the tracks have been read, and the sky opens wide again. You stand at the entrance of your shelter and look out across a white horizon that feels both endless and intimate. Winter may slow movement, but it does not stop it entirely. Paths still exist beneath snow. Connections remain. You imagine a narrow trail packed firm by repeated footsteps between shelters in a winter village. Each step compresses powder into a faint ribbon of darker snow. Over days and weeks, these paths become reliable corridors linking families together. Historical accounts from plains and northern forest communities describe how winter villages maintained short practical pathways between lodges even during deep snow. Travel beyond the immediate settlements slowed significantly, yet local movement persisted. You step carefully onto the imagined path and feel how packed snow supports your weight better than untouched drifts. Snowshoes crafted from wood frames and woven sinew made longer journeys possible when necessary. Archaeological discoveries include remnants of snowshoe frames and binding materials, confirming their widespread use in snowy regions. These tools extended mobility during winter months, allowing hunting, trade, and communication to continue. Researchers continue to study how winter travel routes followed natural contours such as frozen rivers or ridgelines, where snow accumulation differed. Frozen waterways often served as highways across otherwise difficult terrain. You picture a small group setting out across a frozen river, moving steadily beneath a pale sky. Trade items carried carefully in bundles, messages exchanged between distant communities despite the cold. An intriguing historical observation notes that in some regions, winter trade was not entirely halted but adjusted. Lightweight, high-value goods were favoured to reduce burden in snow. You pause at the entrance of your shelter again and imagine visitors approaching along the packed path, their figures dark against the white landscape. Hospitality extends even in winter, though supplies are measured. Ethnographic records describe winter gatherings where neighbouring groups met to exchange good stories and news, while large-scale travel diminished, local networks remained active. Scholars still debate how extensive winter trade networks were in particularly harsh climates. Some evidence suggests that communities preferred to rely on stored resources during deep winter, resuming broader exchange in spring. You return inside and sit near the hearth, contemplating how your shelter functions within this larger web. It is not isolated. It is one node in a network of winter dwellings. Archaeological surveys of clustered lodge sites reveal organized layouts suggesting communal planning rather than random settlement. Paths likely formed naturally between these structures. You imagine the sound of snowshoes brushing across packed trails outside, then the soft bend and rise as someone enters through the tunnel. Warm air greets them immediately. A lesser-known anecdote recounts how some winter visitors brought small gifts such as dried berries or crafted items, reinforcing social bonds during months of limited travel. Researchers continue to analyze the role of frozen rivers in facilitating communication. Ice provided stable surfaces for sleds and foot travel that would be impossible in other seasons. You glance toward your straered pit, aware that sharing must be balanced with prudence. Generosity strengthens alliances, yet winter demands foresight. The fire glows steadily, reflecting off the curved walls. Historical evidence suggests that winter pathways sometimes shifted over time as snow depth and wind patterns changed. Communities adapted routes seasonally. You step once more outside and follow the imagined path a short distance before turning back. The shelter remains visible only as a gentle mound. Scholars continue to explore how winter mobility influenced cultural exchange across regions. Even limited contact during cold months maintained relationships that proved vital in times of need. You enter the tunnel and rise into warmth. The interior feels calm and secure, yet connected to the world beyond through narrow paths pressed into snow. And as you sit beside the hearth and listen to the faint crunch of distant footsteps along packed trails, you realize that underground shelter does not isolate you from winter. It anchors you within it. The earth holds you steady while pathways stretch outward across frozen ground, linking hearth to hearth in a quiet network of survival and shared endurance. You sit quietly beside the hearth and think about how this shelter might appear to someone seeing it for the first time, unfamiliar with the land and its seasons. From a distance, the mound of earth could seem primitive or temporary. The low entrance might look cramped, the smoke hole small and unassuming. Yet inside you know the steadiness it provides. For centuries, outsiders often misunderstood indigenous winter dwellings, assuming that homes partially built into the ground signaled a lack of architectural sophistication. In reality, these structures reflected careful environmental adaptation and deep practical knowledge. Early European observers sometimes described earth lodges with surprise, remarking on their warmth and durability compared to wooden cabins hastily erected in similar climates. You lean back against the curved wall and let your hand rest on the packed soil. There is nothing accidental about this design. Every contour serves a purpose. Archaeological research over the past century has steadily corrected misconceptions about these dwellings. Excavations reveal complex construction techniques, durable support systems, and evidence of long-term occupation. Semi-subterranean homes were not makeshift shelters, but deliberate seasonal architecture. Scholars still examine how colonial narratives shaped early interpretations of indigenous housing. Some accounts downplayed engineering skill, while others expressed genuine admiration for the efficiency of earth-insulated structures. You glance upward at the smoke opening and imagine a visitor stooping through the entrance tunnel, surprised by the warmth inside. The contrast between exterior cold and interior comfort often challenge preconceived notions. An interesting historical observation notes that some settlers eventually adopted elements of earth shelter design for their own winter survival, building dugouts or sod houses that borrowed directly from indigenous techniques. Adaptation occurred quietly across cultural lines. You sit near the hearth and consider how design choices reflect values. Building low to the ground conserves heat and blends with the landscape. It does not assert dominance over the horizon. It coexists. Researchers continue to analyze how long earth lodges remained in use in certain regions even after contact with Europeans introduced new building materials. In many cases, traditional winter houses persisted because they were simply effective. You rise and walk slowly around the interior, appreciating the balance between space and insulation. The shelter does not feel cramped. It feels contained. A lesser-known anecdote from 19th century accounts recounts how some visitors who initially mocked the appearance of earth lodges later admitted their comfort during severe cold spells. Scholars continue to debate how quickly and under what circumstances indigenous communities modified winter dwellings in response to new tools such as metal axes. Access to stronger cutting implements may have influenced timber selection and construction speed, yet the core principles remained stable. You pause near the entrance and think about the idea of permanence. To an outsider, a structure partly hidden in earth might seem temporary, yet archaeological layers show repeated rebuilding on the same sites over generations. Excavations often uncover multiple floor levels stacked vertically, indicating that new lodges were built atop older ones. Soil preserves these layers as quiet testimony to continuity. You kneel and touch the floor gently. Beneath this surface, countless winters may have passed in similar chambers across the continent. Researchers continue to explore how architectural forms express cultural identity. Winter houses were not only functional, they reflected community organization, seasonal rhythm, and relationship with land. You settle once more on the raised platform and feel warmth settle into your clothing. An intriguing detail preserved in some historical records suggests that certain earth lodges were decorated subtly with painted interior elements or symbolic objects near the hearth, challenging the assumption that practicality excluded aesthetic expression. You look around and imagine such details small but meaningful. Scholars still examine how misunderstandings of indigenous architecture influenced broader cultural narratives about technology and progress. Modern reassessment increasingly recognizes the sophistication of climate-responsive design. You listen to the fire crackle gently. Outside, snow lies silent against the mound. The shelter stands as quiet rebuttal to misconception. It is not crude, it is calibrated, not temporary, intentional. And as you lean back against the steady curve of the wall, you understand that underground winter shelters represent knowledge accumulated over centuries. They reflect adaptation, observation, and resilience. Beneath earth and snow, far from the assumptions of those who once misjudged them, these homes continue to speak softly of skill and foresight. In their warmth and balance, they reveal a deep understanding of place that requires no towering walls to prove its strength. You sit quietly beside the hearth and imagine that centuries pass. The fire fades. The roof beams eventually weaken. Soil collapses inward. Snow and rain settle where warmth once lingered. Time moves gently but persistently, and your winter shelter becomes part of the earth again. Now you picture yourself not as a builder or inhabitant, but as an archaeologist standing above a subtle depression in the ground. The surface looks unremarkable at first glance, just a faint circular dip is surrounded by grass. Yet trained eyes recognize the outline of something older. Archaeological excavation of former winter house sites often begins with careful removal of topsoil to reveal darker rings beneath. These soil stains mark the location of old post holes where timber supports once stood. The wood has long since decayed, but its imprint remains. You kneel and brush soil aside gently with a small trowel. A circle begins to emerge. The floor area appears slightly compacted compared to surrounding ground. Charcoal flecks scatter through the dirt where a hearth once burned. A widely accepted finding in North American archaeology is that semi-subterranean dwellings leave distinct stratigraphic signatures. Layers of ash, compacted floor surfaces, and collapsed roof debris form recognizable patterns even centuries later. You imagine uncovering a ring of stones that once framed the hearth. Their positions are not random. They speak of careful placement and long use. Researchers continue to study how soil chemistry changes in areas of prolonged human occupation. Elevated phosphate levels often indicate where food preparation or animal processing occurred inside winter lodges. You lean closer and notice a small fragment of bone emerging from the soil. It may have been part of a meal shared long ago. Nearby, a broken stone tool rests quietly preserved by earth. An intriguing historical detail is that in some excavated lodge sites, archaeologists have discovered impressions of woven mats preserved in compacted clay floors. Though the organic material itself decayed, its pattern remained faintly visible. You sit back on your heels and imagine mapping the outline of this structure carefully. Measurements reveal its diameter. The spacing of post holes suggests the arrangement of roof beams. Scholars still debate how accurately modern reconstructions replicate original lodge designs. While archaeological evidence provides dimensions and material traces, the full experience of warmth and light must be interpreted carefully. You brush away more soil and uncover a shallow pit near the wall. It might have served as a storage cache. Its position away from the hearth aligns with known patterns. Archaeological findings from Plains Earth Lodge villages often reveal clusters of such depressions, indicating organized settlement layouts. Repeated rebuilding at the same location creates layered histories beneath the surface. You stand and imagine aerial views of ancient winter villages, circular patterns etched faintly into the ground long after roofs have fallen. Researchers continue to explore how climate fluctuations influence site selection over centuries. Periods of drought or colder temperatures may have prompted shifts in settlement patterns reflected in archaeological distribution. You crouch again and uncover a darkened patch of soil thicker than the rest. It may represent repeated hearth-use ash settling gradually into the floor. A lesser-known anecdote from early archaeological work recounts how some excavators initially misidentified lodge depressions as natural features before recognizing their patterned arrangement. You trace the curve of the wall with your hand. Though the structure itself has vanished, its shape lingers in the Earth's memory. Scholars continue to analyze microscopic charcoal particles within soil samples, using them to estimate the intensity and duration of fire use inside ancient winter houses. You imagine piecing together daily life from these fragments. A charred seed hints at stored plant food. A tool fragment suggests craftwork during long evenings. Archaeological interpretation requires patience, much like winter survival itself. Each layer must be read carefully without assumption. You stand once more and look across a field dotted with similar depressions. Each one marks a winter lived beneath earth and snow. Researchers continue to refine dating techniques that allow them to determine how old these dwellings are, revealing sequences of occupation spanning generations. You kneel and press your palm against the soil where the hearth once glowed. It feels cool now, silent. And as you step back from the imagined excavation, you understand that underground winter shelters leave quiet signatures long after voices fade. Timber decays, hides vanish, yet the earth retains outlines and ash. Beneath layers of grass and time, the careful engineering of warmth and safety persists as subtle curves and soil stains. Archaeology listens where memory cannot speak, uncovering the steady logic of those who once lowered themselves into the ground and transformed it into refuge against the cold. You remain in that quiet field of shallow depressions and let your mind drift across centuries. Each circular outline in the soil represents not just a home, but a decision made long ago about how best to survive winter. You imagine those decisions changing slowly over time, shaped by climate resources and contact with neighbouring communities. Archaeological sequences across parts of the Great Plains and the northern woodland show gradual evolution in winter house design. Early pit houses in some regions were smaller and more deeply excavated. Later earth lodges grew broader in diameter with heavier timber frameworks and thicker roof coverings. These changes reflect adaptation rather than sudden invention. Researchers continue to investigate whether certain architectural shifts occurred because of environmental pressures or social transformation. A prolonged cold period might encourage deeper excavation. Population growth could require larger communal structures. Design responds to circumstance. You walk slowly among the imagined outlines and picture one lodge being rebuilt atop another. Over generations, floors rise slightly as new layers of soil and ash accumulate. The landscape becomes a palimpsest of winters. An intriguing historical observation from archaeological reports notes that some lodge sites reveal evidence of experimental construction, such as variations in post placement or unusual hearth configurations. Not every design remained fixed. Builders tested ideas. Scholars still examine how knowledge about winter architecture travelled between communities. Trade routes and intermarriage likely facilitated exchange of techniques, yet regional distinctions persisted strongly. You kneel beside one depression and imagine the first time someone chose to widen the diameter slightly, adding an extra support beam to increase interior space. Perhaps that winter felt particularly harsh, prompting reconsideration of insulation thickness. Archaeological data often show that as communities became more sedentary in certain regions, winter dwellings grew more substantial and long-lasting. Increased stability encouraged investment in stronger materials. Researchers continue to debate how the introduction of metal tools after European contact influenced construction methods. With iron axes, timber could be shaped more efficiently, yet the underlying principle of earth insulation did not vanish. You trace a line in the soil where a wall once curved and think about the tension between tradition and innovation. Too much change risks failure in extreme weather. Too little change ignores new possibilities. A lesser-known anecdote from early ethnographers describes how some elders resisted altering proven lodge designs, preferring the safety of familiar structure. Innovation required trust. Scholars still explore how climate shifts during periods such as the Little Ice Age may have influenced winter house depth and reinforcement. Colder decades could leave subtle signatures in archaeological layers. You rise and imagine looking down at this field from above, seeing patterns expand and contract over time. Some villages grow larger, others shrink or relocate. Archaeological radiocarbon dating techniques allow modern researchers to place these changes within approximate timelines, revealing cycles of occupation and abandonment. You step carefully between depressions and reflect on how each design represented accumulated memory. Builders did not consult blueprints, they consulted experience. Researchers continue to examine soil samples from different time periods to understand how construction materials evolved. Variations in roof thickness or wall reinforcement suggest incremental learning. An interesting historical detail mentions that in some areas, lodge orientation shifted slightly over centuries, possibly reflecting subtle changes in prevailing wind patterns or cultural preference. You pause at the centre of the imagined field and consider how debates among modern scholars mirror quiet debates long ago among builders. Should the entrance face slightly more eastward? Should the smoke opening be narrower? Scholars still argue whether certain architectural similarities across distant regions indicate direct cultural diffusion or parallel problem-solving in similar climates. The question remains open. You kneel once more and press your hand against the earth. Beneath it lie traces of countless decisions about warmth and safety. Archaeological interpretation continues to refine understanding of seasonal occupation patterns, revealing that some communities use semi-subterranean dwellings exclusively in winter, while living in different structures during warmer months. You stand and look across the field again. Change did not erase tradition, it layered upon it. Researchers continue to explore how winter architecture reflects resilience, showing communities adjusting to shifting resources without abandoning core principles. And as you let the image of ancient lodge outlines settle in your mind, you recognize that underground shelters were never static. They evolved slowly, shaped by environment and experience. Beneath each curve of earth lies not only protection from cold, but evidence of thoughtful experimentation. Across centuries, winter builders refined their designs, quietly testing, adjusting, remembering. In the soil's faint depressions and darkened hearth circles, you see the imprint of adaptation itself, steady and deliberate, carried forward by those who understood that survival depends on learning as much as on shelter. You leave the field of ancient outlines behind and return in your mind to the living warmth of the shelter itself. The hearth glows steadily, the walls curve around you like familiar arms. Outside, winter still stretches wide and pale, but inside the air feels measured and kind. You sit quietly and reflect on what survival truly feels like in this space. It does not feel heroic. It does not feel like defiance shouted against a blizzard. It feels deliberate, calm, almost ordinary. A consistent finding in both archaeological research and ethnographic accounts is that semi-subterranean winter shelters were not emergency improvisations. They were expected, planned, and integrated into seasonal cycles. People did not stumble into them in desperation. They built them with foresight long before snow fell. You lean back against the packed earth wall and let your breathing slow. The shelter does not groan. The fire does not rage. Everything functions within a narrow, steady range. Researchers continue to emphasize that survival in harsh climates often depends more on preparation than on raw endurance. The strength of these underground homes lies in advanced planning, accumulated knowledge, and cooperation. You think about the many small choices that brought you here. The slope selected to avoid wind, the soil tested by hand, the roof beams angled carefully, the entrance tunnel shaped to trap cold air. None of these decisions required extraordinary strength. They required attention. An interesting historical observation appears in several early accounts where visitors expressed surprise at how unremarkable winter life inside earth lodges seemed. There were no dramatic gestures, just steady routines. Scholars still examine how modern narratives sometimes romanticize survival in extreme environments as a test of toughness. Yet the archaeological and ethnographic record suggests something different. It suggests practicality. You reach toward the hearth and adjust a small ember with the tip of a stick. The flame responds gently. No sudden flare, won't fill in the chamber. Outside, wind may stir again, brushing snow across the mound above. Inside, you feel insulated not only by soil and timber, but by predictability. Archaeological evidence of long-term winter occupation supports the idea that these shelters created sustainable living conditions rather than temporary refuges. You shift slightly on the raised platform and feel the layered bedding beneath you. Comfort is subtle but real. The floor does not radiate biting cold. The air does not sting your lungs. Researchers continue to explore how mental resilience connects to environmental stability. A shelter that maintains consistent warmth reduces stress and allows energy to be directed toward community and creativity. You imagine the countless winters spent in similar spaces across plains, forests, and river valleys. Each season passed not through constant struggle but through routine. A lesser-known anecdote recounts how some winter lodges were described as feeling almost womb-like by early visitors, a comparison that highlights the sense of enclosure and protection. You glance upwards at the smoke opening where a thin ribbon of smoke escapes into grey sky. Even that opening feels modest and controlled. Scholars continue to debate how architecture shapes emotional experience. The curved walls of earth lodges likely contributed to feelings of safety, enclosing occupants without harsh corners or exposed beams. You sit quietly and consider the modern world where insulation hides behind drywall and heating systems hum invisibly. Here the system is visible and tangible. You can feel the warmth radiating from soil. You can see smoke rising. Archaeological reconstructions often attempt to capture this sensory reality, demonstrating how temperature differences between inside and outside can be striking. You run your hand once more along the wall. It feels solid, grounded. Winter survival underground is not cinematic. It is rhythmic, repetitive, predictable. Researchers continue to emphasize that indigenous winter architecture represents environmental intelligence refined over generations. You settle deeper into your bedding and close your eyes briefly, listening to the faint crackle of fire. Outside, snow may continue to fall. Inside, warmth holds steady. And as you breathe slowly within this earth-sheltered chamber, you understand that survival here is not about conquering winter. It's about understanding it, planning for it, shaping a space that works quietly and consistently. The shelter does not shout its strength. It demonstrates it through stillness. In that stillness beneath layers of soil and snow, you find the true feeling of endurance. Not drama, not sitcom, just the steady hum of preparation meeting season and the calm knowledge that winter can be lived through with patience and thoughtful design. You notice one morning that the air feels different. It is subtle at first. The cold no longer bites with the same sharp insistence. When you step through the entrance tunnel and stand outside, the snow beneath your boots gives slightly softer than before. Sunlight lingers a little longer on the horizon. Winter is loosening its grip. You stand beside the rounded mound of your shelter and listen. The wind carries a new note, not warm exactly, but less severe. Icicles along the edge of the entrance drip faintly in the afternoon light. The change is gradual, almost shy. Seasonal patterns documented across North America show that communities who relied on semi-subterranean winter homes often transitioned back to lighter, more mobile structures as temperatures rose. Winter lodges were not abandoned in failure. They were left with intention, ready to serve again when frost returned. You step back inside and look around the chamber. The walls have held warmth for months. The hearth bears layers of ash from countless small fires. The raised platforms have supported rest through long nights. Researchers continued to study how spring thaw affected winter dwellings. Meltwater required careful drainage. Roofs were sometimes repaired or partially dismantled as communities prepared to move. You kneel by the hearth and let the embers burn down gently. The fire that once guarded against bitter cold now feels less urgent. An intriguing historical detail notes that in some traditions, winter houses were cleaned thoroughly before departure, ashes removed, storage pits, emptied entrances sealed lightly against animals until the next season. You rise and run your hand along the curved wall once more. The soil feels cool but not frozen. It has served its purpose faithfully. Scholars still examine how the cyclical use of winter shelters reinforced seasonal rhythms within indigenous societies. Movement between different types of dwellings reflected deep knowledge of environmental patterns. You step outside again and look across the landscape. Snow recedes slowly near exposed patches of ground. Water glimmers faintly in distant channels. Archaeological evidence often shows repeated rebuilding of winter lodges on the same sites year after year, indicating that departure did not mean abandonment. It meant pause. You imagine gathering tools, rolling hides, and preparing for travel. The shelter behind you remains quiet, its low profile blending back into the land. Researchers continues to explore how seasonal mobility influenced social structure, allowing communities to adapt fluidly to shifting resources throughout the year. You take one final look at the entrance tunnel and the smoke opening above. For months, that small Tukatl framed grey sky and falling snow. Now it frames pale blue and drifting clouds. A lesser-known anecdote from early accounts suggests that some families marked their winter lodge sites subtly before leaving, ensuring they could locate them easily when autumn returned. You crouch and brush loose snow from the threshold one last time. The chamber inside feels calm, almost grateful. Scholars continue to analyze how environmental knowledge guided these cycles, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of climate long before modern meteorology. You step away slowly, feeling the firmness of thawing ground beneath your boots. The mound stands quietly part of the landscape once more. And now, as the season softens, your breath slows as well. The shelter has carried you through frost-storm darkness and stillness. The wind no longer roars, it sighs gently across melting drifts. You imagine the hearth inside resting embers, cold but ready to be rekindled when winter returns. The walls remain curved and patient. You turn your face toward lengthening light and allow your thoughts to settle. Winter underground has been steady, measured, careful. You have watched Earth hold warmth, seen snow transform from threat to insulation, listened to stories echo softly within curved walls. Now the land awakens gradually. The river will run free again. The forest will stir. Paths once packed in snow will dissolve into soft ground. You take a final slow breath and let the image of the shelter fade into quiet memory. The earth remains beneath you, constant and reassuring. Seasons turn above it, shifting and flowing. And as you drift gently towards rest, you carry with you the calm knowledge that warmth can be shaped from soil and timber, that patience can outlast frost, and that beneath even the harshest winter sky, refuge waits quietly below the surface. The wind softens, the light lingers. You close your eyes and let the warmth of memory settle around you like earth itself. Sweet dreams.